It began on a quiet night when the streets of St. Petersburg seemed to breathe beneath a thin mist, and somewhere a young woman was alive for the very last time. On July 31st, 2022, Anastasia Kamalisa walked home after an afternoon with friends, smiling free at last from the relationship that had drained her spirit. At exactly 9:20 that evening, a neighbor saw her unlock the door to her apartment and step inside suitcase, half packed for the life she had been planning in South Korea. By midnight, she would never be seen alive again, and yet her social media account kept posting as if nothing had happened. How could someone vanish from her own apartment while the world still heard her voice online? Good evening, and thank you for being here tonight, because the story I'm about to tell you is one of those cases that keeps investigators awake at night. These are stories of people who trusted the wrong heart, entered the wrong room, or simply lived in the wrong moment, and each one reminds us how thin the line can be between safety and tragedy. Anastasia Kamalisa was 26 years old that summer, a tattoo artist known online as Gishman. To her followers, she was bright, creative, endlessly expressive, the kind of person who turned pain into art. She lived in a small apartment filled with sketchbooks, camera gear, and the faint scent of ink and coffee. Friends described her laugh as sharp and quick, her eyes full of energy that seemed to hide exhaustion she never talked about. Every morning, she brewed coffee before sketching new designs. Every night, she scrolled through messages from fans who saw her as a symbol of independence. She loved K-pop, anime, and rainy city streets after dark. On her right wrist, she had tattooed a single word: freedom. Her grandmother had raised her after her father disappeared, and her mother remarried, and even as success grew, she never forgot the woman who once asked only one question before supporting every decision: would it make you happy? That kind of love shaped her more than fame ever did. St. Petersburg was not the kind of city where people expected horror behind locked doors. The locals prided themselves on calm neighborhoods, art studios, tucked into narrow lanes and apartment blocks where neighbors greeted one another by name. Crime stories happened elsewhere. In Anastasia's building, people left shoes in the hallway without fear of theft. The lobby smelled faintly of old wood and cheap perfume, and the security system worked more for convenience than necessity. It was exactly the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. But safety, as it turned out, was only an illusion. That Thursday evening, Anastasia's routine was predictable. She met a friend for coffee at 6, walked home before 9, and texted that she would finish packing that night. A neighbor watering plants heard the sound of her door closing, the click of the deadbolt, and the silence that followed. At 9:30, her phone lit up with a message from a man who refused to let her go, her ex-boyfriend, Dmitry. Minutes later, she stopped responding to everyone else. The next day, her friends saw new photos posted on her account, cheerful captions that didn't sound like her. Days passed. Her mother sent messages that were answered with single words: something felt wrong. When police finally entered her apartment, 9 days later, they found a scene frozen in time: suitcase open, passport ready, a coffee cup still half full. And in the bathroom, the truth waiting to be discovered. When the first detectives arrived, led by Captain Orlov, they felt confusion rather than clarity. There was no forced entry, no broken lock, no struggle in the living room. The air was heavy, still, the kind of stillness that clings to the skin. They moved through rooms methodically, gloved hands hovering over every object. A phone lay on the desk, battery dead but wiped clean. Paintings leaned against the wall, as if waiting to be hung in another life. The neighbor, Mrs. Karpova, said she had heard nothing unusual that week. No shouting, no music, only the faint hum of a television around midnight. But when investigators opened the bathroom door, Every breath in the room stopped. There lay Anastasia lifeless, surrounded by traces of water, long dried on tile, as if time itself had paused to watch what had been done. If you're the kind of person who stays up late listening to stories like this, who finds something compelling about the mysteries that law enforcement can't quite solve, then I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button and maybe drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Because there's something about late nights that makes these stories hit differently, isn't there? Now, before we go any further, maybe lock your door if you haven't already, turn off the lights if you're feeling brave, and just listen. Because outside right now, the rain has started at first, just a few drops tapping softly against the window, then building slowly into a steady rhythm. The kind of sound that makes the world feel smaller and the darkness feel closer, and it's in that darkness with that rain as our soundtrack that I'm going to tell you exactly what happened to Anastasia Kamalisa. The forensic team documented every inch of that apartment, from the faint streaks on the floor to the smear of blood beneath the faucet handle. They lifted fingerprints, traced shoe impressions, and cataloged evidence into numbered bags. Dimitri's name surfaced almost immediately, his messages found in deleted threads, his visits recorded on building cameras. For the next 72 hours, investigators reconstructed the final moments of Anastasia's life: a confrontation, an argument, a knife drawn in anger, then silence. Outside, the rain continued masking the city's noise, while a million screens still showed her smiling face, unaware that behind that image lay the story of obsession, control, and the loss of a woman who only wanted freedom. Anastasia Kamalisa had always been the kind of person who felt everything too deeply. Even as a child, emotion ran through her like current, through wire, bright, erratic, impossible to contain. Born in 1996 in the industrial outskirts of St. Petersburg, she grew up in a single cramped room where wallpaper peeled from the walls and winter air crept through cracked glass. There was no privacy, no space of her own, just a bed she shared with her mother Alina, who worked 2 jobs and came home with eyes too tired to meet her daughters. Her father had vanished before she could even form memories of him, leaving only silence and a name that was never spoken aloud. In that narrow space between survival and neglect, Anastasia discovered imagination as her only escape. She drew faces on scraps of newspaper, painted with melted candle wax, and used the walls as her first canvas. Art to her wasn't hobby, it was oxygen. By the time she turned 12, her mother sent her to live with her paternal grandmother in a small town called Kolpino. For the first time, she had a room of her own. The window looked out onto a courtyard of birch trees, and the sound of passing trains became the lullaby of her adolescence. Her grandmother, a quiet woman with kind eyes and arthritic hands, never scolded Anastasia for the strange drawings that filled the walls. She simply asked, "Does it make you happy?" And when the answer was yes, she would nod as if that alone was reason enough. Under that patient love, Anastasia blossomed. She began painting at local fairs, sketching portraits for neighbors, and saving every ruble she earned to buy ink. Those early years were marked by hunger, yes, but also by a fierce kind of freedom that would define her entire life. By 15, her art had grown darker. The colors she used were no longer bright, but muted grays, bruised purples, the shades of quiet suffering. She began experimenting with tattoos, fascinated by the permanence of ink beneath skin. While other girls her age talked about school dances and television shows, she studied anatomy books and watched videos of tattoo artists working with surgical precision. Her grandmother didn't forbid it. Instead, she accompanied her to the parlor, watching her granddaughter's eyes light up with that first sting of the needle. It wasn't rebellion, it was transformation. In those lines of ink, Anastasia found a way to take back control of her own story. At 16, she created an online profile under the name Gishman. Her self-portraits, half dream, half confession, spread through forums devoted to anime, K-pop, and body art. People responded not just to her talent, but to her honesty. She posted about loneliness, about finding beauty in pain, and her words resonated with thousands of strangers. Within 2 years, she was recognized as one of the most promising young tattoo artists in Russia. Her studio corner and street, Petersburg, filled with clients from every walk of life, students, musicians, even local celebrities who wanted to carry a piece of her art on their skin. To them, she seemed fearless, the embodiment of independence. But those closest to her knew she still called her grandmother every night before bed, her voice soft, sometimes breaking, when she spoke about the city's pressure. The people who loved her for the image, but not for who she truly was. Despite her rising fame, Anastasia remained deeply human. She loved instant noodles, sang off-key in the shower, and kept a notebook where she wrote fragments of poems she never showed anyone. She had a cat named Biscuit who slept on her sketchbook, leaving paw prints on unfinished designs. On quiet mornings, she walked along the Neva River with headphones on, sketching mental pictures of strangers' faces. Friends said she had a habit of turning even sadness into art. Once, after a long breakup, she tattooed a broken light bulb on her wrist and joked that at least it gave her something beautiful to look at. That humor, soft, self-deprecating, was what made people trust her. Clients didn't just sit for tattoos. They told her secrets, cried, laughed, and left with more than ink. They left lighter. Yet beneath that empathy lay exhaustion. Constant exposure, the endless demand of online attention, the subtle cruelty of anonymous comments, it all wore her down. She began to speak less in interviews, posting carefully curated images instead of spontaneous joy. The more people admired her, the lonelier she felt. Success had come early, but it carried a cost she never anticipated. In her diary, later found by investigators, she wrote one line that would haunt everyone who read it. "Sometimes I feel like I've turned myself into a brand and lost the person inside." Those words, written in neat, delicate script, showed a woman standing at the edge of transformation once again, though this time, the price would be her life. Kolpino, her childhood refuge, remained her mental sanctuary. Whenever she visited, she walked the same streets where she once sold sketches for coins. Neighbors still remembered the quiet girl with the big eyes who dreamed of color. Her grandmother kept every magazine clipping, every photograph of her granddaughter's success tucked carefully into a folder labeled "My Star." It was that woman, warm, simple, proud, who would later sit in front of cameras after Anastasia's death and whisper that she had felt something was wrong weeks before but didn't know how to reach her. The city had taken her in, loved her, and then consumed her. At 22, Anastasia met Dmitry Churyshev, a man who seemed to mirror her creative intensity. Their meeting felt like fate, two artists both damaged, both yearning for meaning. But those who watched them together noticed the way his hand lingered on her shoulder, a little too long, the way his compliments sounded like possession. To outsiders, it looked romantic. To those who listened closely, it sounded like the beginning of control. It was in that moment, long before any crime, that the tragedy had already begun taking shape. Long before Anastasia met him, Dmitry Churyshev had already been shaped by loss. Born in a gray industrial town called Omsk, he grew up in a house where silence ruled like law. His mother died when he was a child, and his father remarried quickly, bringing in a woman who treated the boy like a ghost in his own home. Dmitri learned to survive by retreating inward, by turning his feelings into small secret rituals, counting steps, sketching faces of people he would never speak to, and writing poems no one would ever read. To neighbors, he was quiet, polite, forgettable. To those who looked closer, there was something unreadable in his eyes, a kind of vacancy that could masquerade as calm. That emptiness would one day become the mask he wore too well. When he reached his 20s, Dmitri followed his girlfriend Margarita to St. Petersburg. She was the kind of woman who believed in fixing broken things, and Dmitri, with his gentle voice and tragic stories, was a perfect project. They moved into a small apartment with peeling paint and dreams of success. He worked in web design, but his real ambition lay elsewhere. He wanted attention not through art like Anastasia, but through performance, through being seen. Online, he began posting photos of luxury cars and moody self-portraits. His captions read like poetry, but between the lines, there was hunger, a desire not just for admiration, but control. To Margarita, he was brilliant but misunderstood. To himself, he was a man destined to be discovered. The turning point came when Margarita introduced him to her tattoo artist. That artist was Anastasia. Their meeting, simple as it seemed, altered the trajectory of 3 lives. She was already well known by then, confident, luminous, a little untouchable. Dmitri booked an appointment for a tattoo on his forearm, and as the machine buzzed, something electric passed between them. He told her about his drawings, his loneliness, the poetry he never showed anyone. She listened, eyes focused on her work, but something about him stirred a strange mix of empathy and danger. She saw pain and wanted to heal it. He saw light and wanted to own it. Within weeks, he began visiting her studio under the pretext of touch-ups. Their conversations stretched long after closing time, turning from art to childhoods, to dreams, to the parts of themselves they had never told anyone else. When he spoke, he made her feel like the only person in the world who understood him. He flattered her intellect, her independence, her defiance of convention. But slowly, imperceptibly, his attention became surveillance. He wanted to know who she talked to, where she went, why she hadn't replied sooner. At first, it felt like passion. Then it started to feel like pressure. Anastasia's friends noticed the change before she did. Her laughter grew, forced her social posts less spontaneous. Dmitri began appearing in her photos, always close, always watching. He had an intensity that could be charming in public, but suffocating in private. He managed her bookings, her messages, her collaborations, insisting it was to protect her from exploitation. "Let me take care of it," he'd say, "you just focus on your art." What sounded like devotion was control disguised as love. Soon, every decision passed through him. Meanwhile, Margarita's world crumbled. The man she had supported for 5 years disappeared overnight, leaving nothing but debts and excuses. When she confronted him, he dismissed her with hollow apologies and soft eyes that no longer looked familiar. The betrayal was complete, but Dmitri didn't look back. He had found someone new to orbit, someone brighter, someone whose fame he could absorb. Anastasia became both his lover and his ladder. As their relationship deepened, Dmitri's influence grew darker. He pushed her to expand into adult content, promising it would be art, not exploitation. He used words like freedom and expression, twisting them until they matched his own ambitions. When she hesitated, he reminded her how much she owed him, how he had guided her career, how he believed in her when others didn't. Manipulation disguised as encouragement. She wanted to believe he was right, but deep down fear began to take root. The final fracture came during a televised interview. Anastasia agreed to appear on a talk show called Beyond the Line, expecting to discuss art. Instead, she walked into an ambush. The producers had secretly invited both her estranged mother and Dmitri's ex-girlfriend Margarita. Before a national audience, her life unraveled. Her mother wept, calling her daughter lost. Margarita accused Dmitri of emotional abuse. The host demanded answers, while cameras captured every tear, every tremor. Anastasia defended him, insisting their love was misunderstood, calling her choices acts of empowerment. Dmitri sat backstage, expression unreadable, watching her protect him as he had taught her to. After the broadcast, public opinion split. Some admired Anastasia's defiance, others called her delusional. The pressure online became suffocating. Her sponsors withdrew, her reputation fractured. Inside their apartment, the air grew heavy with unspoken resentment. Dmitri, jobless and dependent on her income, began resenting the woman he had once worshipped. Arguments turned into accusations. She wanted out. He refused to let go. It was no longer love, it was possession. Friends later recalled her final messages, that she was planning to leave the country, that she finally felt free. But in stories like these, freedom often comes too late. The man who once whispered poetry into her ear would soon write her final chapter with a blade. The transformation was complete. The charmer had become the killer. The talk show had been meant to elevate her career, a platform to prove she was more than scandal. Instead, it became a spectacle of humiliation. When the studio lights dimmed and applause faded, Anastasia walked off stage, shaking mascara-streaked hands, trembling as though her body could no longer hold the weight of what had just happened. Dmitri met her in the corridor, eyes calm, smile practiced. He whispered, "You did well. You defended us." But the praise was empty. The truth was he enjoyed the chaos. Public shame kept her dependent, reminded her that without him the world was cruel. In the weeks that followed, Anastasia's confidence eroded. Sponsors stopped calling. Former clients avoided her. Even the followers who once adored her flooded her comments with judgment disguised as advice. Dmitri used it all as evidence of his prophecy. "See," he would say, "they only loved your image. I'm the only one who really loves you." Isolation tightened its grip. She withdrew from friends, stopped answering calls, and began skipping interviews. The apartment became her world, four walls filled with silence, and his voice dictating what came next. Meanwhile, Dmitri's control over her finances deepened. Every payment from her studio or online courses passed through him first. He insisted it was just easier for taxes. He tracked her messages, her location, even her purchases. When she confronted him, he laughed and said, "You'd be lost without me." It wasn't a threat, but a prophecy disguised as affection. To outsiders, they still appeared glamorous, a creative couple, living the dream. Inside, Anastasia lived on eggshells, careful not to ignite his temper. His mood swung between devotion and disdain, apology and accusation, until she could no longer tell which version of him was real. Her grandmother noticed the change during a rare video call. Anastasia's smile didn't reach her eyes, her laughter sounded rehearsed. When asked if everything was all right, she replied softly, "It's just stress. Fame isn't as fun as people think." It was the kind of answer meant to end a conversation, not start one. That was the last time the old woman saw her granddaughter alive. By midsummer of 2022, Anastasia decided to leave. Friends later recalled that she had begun selling furniture, canceling clients, and speaking about a new life in South Korea. She wanted to start a tattoo studio in Seoul, far away from Dmitri, from gossip, from everything that reminded her of who she had been. She had even met someone new, a blogger named Kirill, who treated her with a gentleness that felt almost unreal after years of manipulation. For the first time in months, she was smiling again, not for a camera but for herself. On July 31st, she met Kirill for coffee near the river. They talked about art, travel, and freedom. Witnesses remembered how alive she seemed, how she laughed without hesitation. When they parted that evening, Kirill walked her to her car. She promised to call when she got home, but instead of a message hours later, he received a text that felt foreign, cold, final. "Let's not meet again. Take care." He tried calling again and again, but there was only silence. The woman who had radiated warmth hours earlier had disappeared behind a digital wall. During the following days, Anastasia's social media remained active: posts, photos, even responses to comments, but something about them felt wrong. The captions lacked her usual rhythm, her humor replaced by mechanical phrasing. Her friends sensed it instantly. "It doesn't sound like her," one said. Her mother dismissed their worries, saying Anastasia just needed space. But the people who truly knew her recognized that the digital Anastasia was a ghost. Then came the encounter that shattered the illusion. A close friend ran into Dmitri at a social gathering. When she asked where Anastasia was, he smiled thinly and said, "She asked me to help her go far away, and I did." The words were delivered calmly, almost playfully, but behind them was a chill that froze her blood. That night, the friend called police. Her voice shook as she repeated what he had said. Investigators took the report seriously, but without direct evidence, all they could do was perform a wellness check. When officers arrived at Anastasia's apartment on August 9th, they found the door locked from inside. No answer. No sound. They broke it open. The air inside was heavy, metallic. A suitcase sat open on the floor, half filled with clothes and papers. On the table lay a passport and plane tickets to Seoul dated for the following week. The scene spoke of departure interrupted. In the bathroom, the nightmare waited. The floor was slick, the mirror cracked, the walls flecked with dark stains that had long dried. Anastasia's body lay in the tub, lifeless wounds deep and deliberate. The brutality was personal, not random. She had been killed by someone who wanted her silenced forever. When police tracked Dmitri down, he was calm, rehearsed, even polite. He claimed she had asked him to help her disappear. Later, under pressure, he confessed in fragments, weaving contradictions like a man building walls out of words. Self-defense, mercy, accident, each version collapsing into the next. But one detail destroyed every lie. When asked about her final words, he admitted she had begged him to call for help. No one asking for death begs to be saved. That moment tore through every illusion he had built, exposing what everyone already suspected: it had never been love. It had always been control. The court would later call it a crime of passion, but those who knew her called it something else: a theft. Dmitri stole not just her life, but the future she was days away from claiming. He left behind silence, a half-packed suitcase, and an old woman waiting by the phone for a call that would never come. The trial of Dmitri Churyshev began in January 2023, under a gray sky that seemed to mirror the mood of the city. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, some carrying flowers for Anastasia, others holding photographs of her smiling face printed from old social media posts. Inside, the air was thick with whispers and the rustle of reporters' notebooks. Dmitri entered wearing a plain black sweater, expressionless, his once carefully styled hair now uneven, as if he had cut it himself. He did not look at the Kamelisa family. He looked at the cameras. From the start, his defense was a web of contradictions. He claimed Anastasia had begged him to end her suffering, that she was depressed, that her death was an act of mercy. Yet the evidence told another story. The autopsy revealed defensive wounds, bruises, a struggle. The messages he sent from her phone after she died showed calculation, not remorse. He had used her accounts to convince friends and family that she was still alive, maintaining a digital illusion while her body lay hidden. Every post he made in her name extended the lie, keeping her ghost alive just long enough to protect himself. The courtroom grew silent as prosecutors projected screenshots on the screen, smiling emojis, cheerful captions, all written by the man who had killed her. Witnesses testified one by one. Kirill, the blogger who had met her days before her death, told the court about her plans to move abroad. Her grandmother, frail but resolute, described the last phone call they shared, her voice cracking as she said, she sounded free. That single word, free, hung in the courtroom like a curse. It was what Anastasia had always wanted, and what Dmitri could never allow. The prosecutor spoke next, his tone steady, but heavy with restrained anger. He described a pattern of psychological domination, financial control, and calculated isolation that stripped Anastasia of everything except her art. He didn't kill her in one night, the prosecutor said. He killed her slowly over years, until the only thing left was her body. When it was Dmitri's turn to speak, he showed no emotion. He talked about love, about jealousy, about mistakes made in passion. He described himself as a victim of his own feelings. The judge listened, but showed no sympathy. Every time he spoke of himself, the audience grew colder. The verdict came quickly. Guilty of murder. 8 years in prison. Gasps filled the room. 8 years for a life taken for months of deception, for the cruelty of pretending she was still alive. Her grandmother wept quietly, whispering that even justice felt hollow. Outside the courthouse, rain mixed with snow, turning the pavement to slush. Reporters surrounded prosecutors, asking if the sentence was fair. Most avoided answering. They knew the system had failed before it even began. Dmitri was led away in handcuffs, his eyes scanning the crowd for sympathy that never came. Behind him, Anastasia's mother stood stone, still expression unreadable. Some said she had sold interviews to television stations for money. Others said she simply didn't know how to grieve. Whatever the truth, it no longer mattered. The woman who should have protected her daughter had already betrayed her once, and life had done the rest. Anastasia's funeral was filmed by a small production crew who claimed it would honor her memory. Instead, it became another spectacle, cameras zooming in on tears, microphones thrust into faces. The grandmother refused to participate. She buried her granddaughter quietly, without reporters, in a cemetery on the edge of the city where birch trees leaned toward the wind. She placed a single sketchbook on the coffin tied with a ribbon. Inside were the earliest drawings Anastasia had made as a child, faces of women looking toward open windows. Freedom again, the word that defined her life and her death. In the months after the trial, the apartment where Anastasia had lived remained sealed. Neighbors said they sometimes heard faint noises from inside, though they knew it was only imagination. Online, her account still existed, frozen in time, followers, leaving messages beneath old posts, as if she might read them somehow. You're missed. Your art changed me. You deserved better. The digital ghost she never wanted had become immortal. Dmitri sits now in a concrete cell in a regional prison outside St. Petersburg. He spends 23 hours a day alone, occasionally reading letters from strangers who still call him misunderstood. He has appealed twice and been denied both times. The irony is cruel. He always wanted fame, and in a way he achieved it. His name is forever linked to the woman whose light he tried to extinguish. For Anastasia's grandmother, grief became routine. Each morning, she lights a candle near the window the same way she once waited for her granddaughter's calls. Sometimes, she murmurs the old question, "Does it make you happy?" as if asking the wind. The silence that follows is the only answer she receives. In a notebook found beside Anastasia's bed, one final line had been underlined 3 times. "Art is what remains when everything else is taken." It feels almost prophetic now. Her art remains. Her story remains. Even when memory fades, the ink endures. Stories like this remind us how fragile the border between love and possession can be, how easily admiration turns into control. Anastasia Kamalisa did everything right. She built, she dreamed, she tried to escape, and still she was trapped by someone who mistook ownership for affection. Her death isn't just a tragedy, it's a warning. Evil doesn't always come from strangers lurking in the dark. Sometimes it smiles beside you, promises to protect you, and quietly decides that if it can't keep you, no one else will. That winter in Nanjing was cruel, the kind of cold that seeped through every layer of clothing and settled in the bones. The streets were nearly empty, blanketed in frost, and the wind cut across the city like broken glass. At dawn on January 10, 1996, a sanitation worker trudged along a narrow road near the university district, pushing his cart through the fog. He noticed a plastic bag lying oddly beside the curb, half buried in slush. Inside, neatly cut pieces of red meat glistened under the streetlight. He thought he had found food. By the time he washed it at home and saw the pale curve of a human finger slip out of his hands, the scream that tore from his throat would mark the beginning of one of China's most horrifying unsolved murders. The man who made that discovery never forgot the smell of disinfectant that filled his kitchen or the sight of the police officers standing frozen around his sink as realization dawned. Within hours, investigators fanned out across the city. More bags appeared, 8 locations in total, each containing fragments of a young woman carefully carved, some cooked, others raw, wrapped like parcels waiting for collection. The air in the morgue was heavy with the metallic tang of cold flesh and disbelief. Detectives who had handled hundreds of cases stood silent before the evidence. No one had ever seen such precision. It was the work of someone who understood anatomy, someone who had taken their time. Before anyone could identify her, the city was already whispering. Students locked their dormitory doors, parents called home from distant provinces, and every sound in the night felt like a threat. The case was given a name that would haunt China for decades, the Nanjing University dismemberment. But behind the headlines, before the horror, there had been a girl named Tao I-ching, and her life had been built on quiet perseverance long before it ended in unspeakable violence. Tao I-ching was born in 1976 in a poor family from Taiho City, Jiangsu Province. The youngest of 3 daughters, she grew up in a house where winter meant wearing her sister's worn-out coat and summer meant patching old shoes instead of buying new ones. Her parents worked factory shifts that barely covered rice and kerosene, but they believed education could rewrite fate. Her elder sister Tao Yihua quit school to work at a textile plant, sending her wages home so I-ching could continue studying. "Study hard," her sister would tell her, "so you can live the life I couldn't." I-ching carried those words like a promise. She was quiet, reserved, the kind of student teachers forgot until they read her essays. In them she wrote about freedom, about light, about wanting to bring pride to her family. When she was accepted into Nanjing University to study computer information management, it was more than an achievement, it was deliverance. For her family, She became a symbol of hope, proof that sacrifice could lead somewhere. When she boarded the train to the city in 1995, her mother wrapped a red scarf around her neck and said, "Don't get cold and don't trust strangers." Simple words that in hindsight feel like a prophecy ignored by time. At the university, she lived modestly in a shared dorm room that smelled of instant noodles and chalk dust. Her classmates described her as neat and polite, always focused, rarely distracted by gossip or fashion. She wore the same few sweaters each week, but kept them immaculately clean. She spent hours in the library, often skipping meals to finish assignments. When friends invited her to social events, she declined gently, saying she wanted to make her family proud. Her dorm mates teased her for being old-fashioned, but they respected her discipline. What they didn't know was that beneath her calm exterior, she carried the constant awareness of debt, the invisible weight of her sister's sacrifice of every yuan earned through someone else's exhaustion. The campus itself seemed like a world immune to crime. Nanjing University was a haven of scholars and idealists, its courtyards lined with ginkgo trees and statues of poets. Professors lectured about progress, not fear. The worst incidents anyone remembered were stolen bicycles or noisy parties. Students often studied late into the night, wandering between dorms under the faint glow of street lamps. Doors were rarely locked. The idea that something monstrous could be lurking among them was unthinkable. Yet safety, as always, was only an illusion waiting to shatter. On the afternoon of January 10th, I-Ching left her dormitory, carrying a backpack and a small notebook. She told her roommate she planned to review notes in the library. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. Hours later, the city's sanitation department found that first bag on Wu Road. Within 2 days, more were discovered, some near the sports field, others behind classroom buildings, all within walking distance of the dorms. Each contained parts that, when assembled, painted a portrait of unimaginable cruelty. It would take forensic experts weeks to confirm what her family already feared. When detectives visited the Tao household to break the news, her sister collapsed before they could finish speaking. Her father sat motionless, whispering the same words over and over. She just wanted to study. The family's grief became a mirror for the nation's disbelief. No one could comprehend how such horror could touch a place dedicated to knowledge and youth. Newspapers called it the crime that stole China's sleep. Forensics confirmed the cuts were surgical, clean, deliberate, efficient. Whoever did this wasn't panicked. They were meticulous. By the end of that frozen January, Nanjing no longer felt like a city of scholars. It felt like a city holding its breath. Students avoided walking alone. Every sound of a closing door made hearts jump. And somewhere among thousands of residents, a killer moved unseen, someone who had studied anatomy not to heal but to destroy. Before the world knew her name, Tao I-Ching was just another face in a lecture hall, a quiet girl who carried herself with a mixture of humility and purpose. Her friends called her Little Tao, a nickname that reflected both affection and respect. In a time when most students dreamed of romance or city life, she dreamed of stability, a steady job, a small apartment for her parents, maybe a chance to see them rest for the first time in decades. Her life was simple, almost ordinary, and that was what made her death so unfathomable. She didn't chase danger, she chased a future. Each morning, she rose before dawn in the dim dormitory light, careful not to wake her roommates. She boiled water for tea in a dented kettle, reviewed notes, and walked to class with her books pressed close to her chest. Her classmates remembered that she always took the same seat, third row from the front, second from the left. She listened intently, eyes fixed on the blackboard, scribbling every word even when the lecture drifted into abstract theory. Her professors often said she reminded them of students from another era, serious, disciplined, untouched by distractions. When she smiled, it was small and fleeting, as if she didn't quite believe she had earned the right to it yet. Her letters to her family were filled with modest optimism. She wrote about the campus trees turning gold in autumn, about the cafeteria serving sweet buns on Fridays, about how she had borrowed an old computer from the library to practice programming. She told her sister not to worry about money and promised that one day she would repay every yuan spent on her tuition. The letters ended with the same sentence every time: "Please stay warm." She mailed them once a week, never late. It was her way of staying tethered to the people who had built her foundation with their own hands. Outside of academics, I Ching lived a life marked by quiet rituals. On Sundays, she washed her clothes by hand in the dormitory sink, hanging them neatly on the line by the window. In the evenings, she studied under the soft light of a desk lamp, a blanket over her legs, glasses slipping down her nose. Sometimes when she grew tired, she would hum a melody without words, something she had learned as a child while helping her mother cook. Her roommates teased her for being too serious, saying she would make a terrible girlfriend but a perfect accountant. She only laughed and kept writing. Love, she once told them, could wait. Success could not. To those around her, she seemed almost protected by the calmness she carried. Even when she was upset, like the time her roommate accidentally caused both of them to be fined for breaking dormitory rules, she never raised her voice. She apologized, paid her half of the fine, and went back to studying. That same day, she wrote in her diary, "Sometimes life is unfair, but maybe endurance is another form of courage." Her words, later found by police among her belongings, read like a quiet echo of the strength she never realized she would need. Life on campus in the mid-90s had a gentle rhythm. Students crowded cafeterias with trays of steaming noodles, bicycles filled the pathways between dorms, and laughter drifted from open windows. The university stood like a small city within the larger one, seemingly sealed from the chaos beyond its gates. At night, the lights from the dormitories shimmered like constellations, each window a tiny world of youth and ambition. For I Ching, it was paradise, fragile, fleeting, but real. She believed that good effort brought good outcomes, that the world rewarded those who meant no harm. It was a belief shared by many in that era, a belief that would soon be shattered. The evening before she disappeared, she spoke with her sister on the phone. The call was short but warm. She said she was preparing for an exam and reminded her sister to eat properly despite knowing there was little food at home. She mentioned the weather turning cold and laughed softly when her sister told her to wear 2 pairs of socks. Nothing in her tone suggested fear or danger. It was a conversation of normal life, ordinary, tender, and now forever final. What makes her story so haunting is precisely how normal she was. She wasn't reckless, careless, or naive. She was careful, rational, and kind. She walked the same path to class every day, greeted the same security guard, and returned to the same dorm room every night. She existed in a routine built for safety, surrounded by people who cared for her. And still that wasn't enough. On a campus filled with knowledge and reason, she simply vanished. There were no warnings, no footprints, no witnesses, only the slow unfolding of horror that began with a single plastic bag on a frozen morning. Sometimes it's easy to believe that tragedy seeks those who take risks, those who chase darkness. But Tao Ching's story is the opposite. She did everything right. She followed the rules. She lived gently. And still evil found her. It is that quiet unfairness that has kept her name alive for decades, not through sensationalism but through sorrow. On the afternoon of January 10, 1996, Tao Yiching walked out of her dormitory, carrying her worn canvas backpack, a thermos of tea, and the same notebook she always kept at her side. The campus loudspeakers played a cheerful pop song about youth and dreams, but she didn't linger to listen. She had just finished an argument with the dorm supervisor over a fine she didn't deserve, and though she smiled politely, the injustice stayed with her. Her roommates watched her cross the courtyard, her red scarf bright against the pale winter light, until she disappeared behind the library building. No one knew it would be the last time they would ever see her. Evening settled early that night. By 6 o'clock, the streets around the university were slick with frost, the kind that turns every breath into a cloud. Inside the dormitory, students huddled around electric heaters, talking about exams and weekend plans. When the clock reached 9, someone realized Yiching hadn't returned. It wasn't unusual. She often studied late in the library. But when midnight came, and her bed remained neatly made, her friends began to worry. They called the library phone. No answer. They checked the cafeteria, the computer lab, the common room. Nothing. Her shoes by the door, her cup on the desk, her coat missing. It looked as though she had simply stepped out for a moment and vanished into the cold. The next morning, her classmates reported her absence to the dorm manager. He dismissed it as stress before exams, suggesting she had gone to a friend's house or taken a short trip. Missing student reports were rare then, and nobody wanted unnecessary trouble. Days passed. Rumors started quietly that she had eloped, that she was sick, that she had gone home without permission. But her family hadn't heard from her. Every morning her sister waited by the phone in Taiho, staring at the silence until it became unbearable. She never forgets to call, she told neighbors. Never. On January 19th, 9 days after she was last seen, the truth began to surface from beneath the snow. The sanitation workers' discovery of that first plastic bag triggered panic across the district. By nightfall, more bags appeared, each revelation twisting the knife of fear deeper into the city's heart. When police connected the evidence to the missing student report from Nanjing University, disbelief turned to horror. The remains belonged to a girl about 19 years old, matching Yiching's description. Her body had been dismembered with surgical precision, every cut deliberate, every trace of identity erased, except for a single mole still visible on a fragment of skin near her cheek. That tiny mark confirmed what everyone had hoped wasn't true. The investigation consumed the campus. Detectives sealed dormitories, interviewed hundreds of students, and combed through classrooms with flashlights that swept across chalkboards and empty desks. The smell of disinfectant mixed with the winter air, leaving a metallic taste in everyone's mouth. Students whispered theories in the cafeteria. Some believed a jealous lover, others a deranged professor. But the facts were stranger and colder. Whoever had done this had knowledge, patience, and confidence. The cuts were smooth, not frantic. The killer had taken organs, cleaned surfaces, and distributed the remains methodically, almost academically. It wasn't rage, it was control. Forensic teams worked around the clock, their gloves stiff from the cold. Without modern DNA technology, they relied on muscle tissue analysis, fingerprints, and clothing fibers. Every discovery raised more questions. The crime scene was everywhere, and nowhere fragments of a life scattered across a city that refused to believe what it was seeing. Reporters gathered outside police headquarters, demanding answers. Officials promised resolution, but delivered none. Behind the formal statements, investigators quietly admitted they had never seen anything like it. "It's as if the killer wanted us to study his work," one officer muttered. Meanwhile, the Tao family traveled to Nanjing to claim what was left of their daughter. The journey took 8 hours by train, each minute heavier than the last. At the morgue, her sister identified her by that small mole in the shape of her hands. Her father collapsed onto the tiled floor, unable to stand. The attendants stepped back, giving the family a moment that words could never reach. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and soundless, covering the city that had failed to protect her. Back at the university, a notice was pinned to the dormitory board. Students are advised to return to rooms before 9 p.m. and report any strangers on campus. Beneath it, someone had written in pencil, "Who protects us from what's already inside." The message was erased within an hour, but the fear remained. Night after night, lights stayed on in the dorms until dawn. No one wanted to close their eyes. No one felt safe. Ai Qing's disappearance was no longer a mystery to solve. It was a wound that refused to heal. For the people who loved her, closure never came. For the investigators, answers never appeared. And for the city of Nanjing, January 1996 became the moment when innocence froze in the snow and never thawed again. The first body bag arrived at the forensic lab before sunrise. Inside were fragments so carefully cut that technicians mistook them at first for medical specimens. By noon, 7 more bags had been collected from alleys, riverbanks, and trash piles around Nanjing University. Every discovery deepened the same unbearable question: what kind of mind could do this? The smell of formaldehyde clung to the corridors, and even seasoned investigators found themselves stepping outside for air. A young officer vomited behind the building, and later admitted he had never been afraid of death until that day. Police sealed the university grounds and transformed lecture halls into temporary command centers. Maps were spread across tables marked with red pins, each one a location where a piece of Tao Ai Qing had been found. The pattern wasn't random. The sites formed a loose circle around the campus, as if the killer wanted investigators to look inward to feel watched. The chief of the task force, Captain Lee, studied the distribution in silence before saying, "He's teaching us something." No one answered. Forensic examination revealed details that unsettled everyone. The dismemberment had been performed with remarkable precision. Muscles were separated along natural lines, joints detached cleanly. There were no ragged edges, no hesitation marks. Whoever handled the knife had practiced on more than one body. Several cuts showed evidence of cauterization, meaning heat had been applied to stop bleeding, a method rarely used outside surgical training. The conclusion was inescapable. The killer had medical knowledge, possibly a surgeon or advanced student. But there was something else. Certain organs were missing entirely. Heart, liver, kidneys, all gone. Whether taken as trophies or for sale, no one could say. The discovery spread through Nanjing like wildfire. Newspapers printed headlines in bold black type: "Female student slain, body cut into pieces." Parents flooded dormitory phone lines, demanding to hear their children's voices. Students carried whistles, some sleeping in groups of 10 in a single room. Professors avoided eye contact with police, terrified of being suspected. Rumors erupted, tales of secret experiments, cults, organ trafficking. The campus that once represented the nation's future now felt like a hunting ground. In the basement morgue, Dr. Zhao, the lead pathologist, worked 18-hour days piecing together fragments like a puzzle from hell. Under harsh fluorescent light, he arranged tissue samples on metal trays, labeling each with trembling hands. "Every cut is calm," he murmured. He wasn't angry. He was curious. Those words chilled the officers present more than any scream could have. Curiosity meant intention. It meant planning, not impulse. As investigators interviewed staff and students, one theme repeated: no one had noticed anything unusual. No blood trails, no missing equipment, no screams in the night. The killer had worked invisibly, blending into the rhythm of campus life. One witness recalled a man in a long coat, carrying a heavy duffel bag near the medical building 2 nights before the discovery. But in winter, every student wore long coats, and no one remembered his face. Days turned into weeks. The city's fear hardened into anger. Posters of Tao I-Ching's smiling ID photo were plastered on walls beside police appeals for information. Candlelight vigils flickered in the snow, students holding hands and whispering prayers. Her classmates wrote essays about safety and sorrow. One line spread across newspapers. She studied to heal machines, but a human machine destroyed her. Inside the task force headquarters, frustration grew. Leads evaporated. Forensics produced no fingerprints, and microscopic analysis found traces of detergent used to wash away evidence. Whoever did this had cleaned everything, even boiling some parts before disposal. Captain Lee slammed his fist against the table. "He's mocking us," he said. But in truth, the killer had already vanished back into the crowd, leaving only precision behind. By February, the official autopsy report reached its grim conclusion. Tao I-Ching had died within hours of leaving her dormitory. There were no signs of sexual assault. Cause of death: massive blood loss from a deep incision to the throat executed with surgical efficiency. Time of death: between 6 and 7 p.m. The report ended with a single note typed in italics: skill level exceeds that of ordinary medical personnel. For her family, those words meant nothing. They buried what little could be recovered in a small village cemetery, the coffin lighter than the grief it carried. Her sister placed the red scarf, the same one she had worn on her last walk, over the lid before the earth closed. The wind blew so cold it cracked her lips, but she didn't move. Somewhere behind them, journalists whispered questions, but no one dared speak the truth aloud. The murderer of Tao I-Ching had not only escaped justice, he had turned science into ritual. When the first spring rain arrived weeks later, washing away the last of the snow, Nanjing still couldn't cleanse itself of the fear. Every splash of water on pavement sounded to students like another footstep in the dark. And even though the killer was never found, his lesson lingered: that knowledge without empathy can carve deeper wounds than any weapon. By the end of February 1996, Nanjing no longer felt like a university city. It felt like a lab suspended in fear. Every conversation returned to the same question: who could have done something so deliberate? Police reports leaked through rumor and whisper. The cuts were clean, the organs missing, the sequence of dissection too systematic for coincidence. Newspapers began using a phrase that sounded more like myth than fact: the anatomy killer. Behind the closed doors of the investigation office, experts tried to reason through the horror. Forensic consultant Dr. Zhao spread photographs across a long table, each image showing sections of tissue that looked more like surgical models than remains. He spoke softly, almost respectfully, as if addressing a colleague instead of describing a killer. "Each incision follows anatomical landmarks, precisely," he said. "This person understood where to cut to avoid bone resistance." That's not something you learn from books. His conclusion silenced the room. Whoever committed the murder had spent years handling human bodies, likely a trained pathologist, medical student, or surgeon. Captain Lee stared at the evidence, his cigarette burning down to ash. He thought of the hospitals, the anatomy labs, the medical schools within the province. There were thousands of possible suspects, yet none stood out. "We're looking for a ghost," he muttered. Outside the police station, the media had already turned the case into a national obsession. The more gruesome the details, the more copies sold. Television anchors spoke of a cannibal doctor, while tabloids hinted at secret experiments. Fear became entertainment and truth drowned under speculation. Within Nanjing University, security tightened. Male students from the medical department faced whispers in corridors. Professors were interrogated repeatedly, some resigning in shame despite innocence. The institution that once symbolized intellect now lived under a cloud of suspicion. Forensic teams re-examined the evidence. Under ultraviolet light, they discovered traces of industrial detergent on several pieces of tissue, confirming the body had been washed meticulously before disposal. This wasn't panic, it was ritual. Dr. Zhao said quietly. He wanted her clean, pure, even. The comment chilled everyone. It implied intimacy, not randomness. It suggested a killer who viewed the act as art. When the investigative psychologists joined the case, they described a mind detached from empathy, possibly narcissistic or godlike in its perception of control. Their profile depicted a man intelligent, methodical, socially isolated, perhaps even respected. "He doesn't kill for pleasure," the report read. "He kills for mastery." At the same time, investigators combed through every record of medical staff in Nanjing, teachers, residents, janitors, anatomy assistants. One by one, they were summoned, questioned, cleared. The suspect list grew shorter and colder. Each time the team thought they had found a lead, it dissolved into nothing. A janitor with late-night access to laboratories had an alibi. A professor with erratic behavior turned out to be terminally ill. The pattern mocked them: knowledge without motive, motive without suspect. The Tao family remained in Nanjing for weeks, staying at a cheap hostel near the station, waiting for progress. Her sister visited the police daily, clutching a photo of I Ching, smiling in her graduation uniform. Each night, she returned to her room, folded the photo back into a wallet, and whispered to it as if her sister could still hear. "We just want to know why." It became a plea that no one could answer. By March, the investigation reached a stalemate. Captain Li ordered the first full review of the timeline. They reconstructed I Ching's final movements, minute by minute, tracing her steps from dormitory to library to the last recorded sighting near the medical building. Witnesses described seeing a man following her, a detail so vague it might have meant anyone. He was tall, wearing glasses, carrying a black case. Every report contradicted the last. One detective, younger and less jaded than the rest, suggested an uncomfortable theory. What if he's one of us? The room fell silent. In the early 90s, cooperation between police and academic departments was common. Medical examiners worked side by side with investigators. It wasn't impossible that someone on the inside had used the chaos to cover his own work, but the idea died quickly. There was no proof, and fear of internal scandal outweighed curiosity. Months passed. The case faded from headlines, but never from memory. The phrase "don't walk alone at night" became a ritual warning, whispered by parents to daughters across China. Forensics had produced every scientific answer except the only one that mattered: the killer's name. Years later, when DNA technology finally reached Chinese labs, old evidence from the Tao case was quietly re-examined. The samples were too degraded to yield results. What remained were photographs typed, reports, and nightmares preserved on paper. In a note left in the archive, Dr. Zhao wrote, "If intelligence is what separates man from beast, then this crime erases that line entirely." The anatomy of evil, that was how historians later described it. A murder so methodical that it looked like study committed in a place devoted to learning. And perhaps that was what made it unforgivable, not only the loss of a young woman's life, but the violation of the very idea that knowledge makes us humane. Spring should have brought warmth to Nanjing that year, but the air remained heavy and cold, as though the city itself refused to thaw. The murder of Tao I-ching had already passed from tragedy into legend, a story retold in whispers by cab drivers, students, and night shift guards. Every new rumor reshaped the truth. A medical student practicing dissections, a surgeon collecting organs for sale, a jealous professor hiding madness behind a white coat. Each version sounded more believable than the silence coming from the police. Fear became a language everyone spoke fluently. In dormitories, lights stayed on until morning. Female students shared beds out of nervous comfort, locking doors and pushing chairs against handles. The echo of footsteps in hallways was enough to freeze conversations. Some refused to use public restrooms after dark. The campus, once filled with laughter and debate, now felt like a hospital ward, quiet, disinfected, watching its own pulse. Professors lectured to half-empty rooms. Parents arrived unannounced to drag daughters home. And everywhere the same question: if the killer was still here, could he be sitting next to us in class? The local media fanned the flames. Daily papers printed sensational sketches of the possible suspect, a nameless man with sharp eyes and surgical hands. Television hosts speculated about psychological motives, using words like obsession and pathology, turning horror into primetime fascination. Even tabloids from Hong Kong sent reporters to Nanjing, chasing photographs of the mourning family. At first, the coverage brought sympathy. Then, it became entertainment. The Tao family's pain was repackaged as headlines, their grief reduced to numbers: 2,000 fragments, 1 missing heart, 0 suspects. Within the police department, morale collapsed. Detectives worked endless shifts chasing false tips. One night, a janitor reported seeing a man carrying a large plastic bag through the science building. The lead ended in a pile of discarded pig organs from the biology lab. Another week, a professor confessed under pressure, only for it to be proven he had been in Beijing the day of the crime. The more the investigation expanded, the smaller the truth seemed to become. Captain Lee stopped giving interviews, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "We're fighting shadows," he told his team. The rumors spread beyond the university. Housewives whispered that the killer cooked the body to hide evidence. Street vendors claimed to have sold meat to a strange man late at night. Taxi drivers began refusing fares near the campus after dark. Even the city's stray dogs became symbols. People said they howled because they could still smell death in the air. When officials announced an increase in patrols, no one felt safer. Nanjing had become a stage for paranoia, and every face was both suspect and victim. Weeks turned into months. The semester ended under a cloud of tension. Graduating students celebrated quietly, their smiles brittle. Tao I-ching's classmates returned home, carrying an unspoken guilt that they had walked the same paths, eaten in the same cafeteria, and yet somehow survived when she hadn't. In Taiho City, her sister stopped opening letters. She said, reading them felt like listening to a voice that no longer belonged to this world. Every few weeks, she traveled back to Nanjing to light incense outside the campus gates. Sometimes students joined her silently, leaving flowers without names. By the summer of 1996, the case had gone cold. Files were boxed, photos archived, and investigators reassigned. But the story refused to die. It lingered in libraries, where pages rustled like whispers in classrooms, where chairs creaked during late-night study sessions. Generations of students inherited the warning as folklore: don't walk alone after dark, don't trust anyone who offers help near the medical building. And beneath the legend was a deeper, quieter fear that the killer had never left. Years later, when journalists revisited the case, they found the same unease still lived in Nanjing. The old university walls had been repainted, but the foundation stones remained the same. Older residents swore that on cold nights, the wind through the courtyard sounded like someone sighing her name. Whether superstition or memory, no one could say. But even decades later, the city carried the ghost of that winter like a scar beneath its skin. What frightened people most wasn't the brutality itself. It was the precision. The idea that someone so educated, so methodical, could commit such horror without leaving a trace. It shattered faith in learning, in progress, in safety through intelligence. For the people of Nanjing, the lesson was bitter and enduring: that knowledge without conscience is the sharpest blade of all. 20 years passed. The buildings changed, the streets filled with new shops and new faces, but the name Tao Wan-ching still haunted Nanjing like a memory carved in frost. For younger students, her story was just a ghost tale told in dormitories on cold nights. For the police, it was a file that gathered dust in the archive room, its edges yellowing with time. But for her sister Tao Yi-hua, it was a wound that never closed. Every year on January 10th, she traveled back to the university gates, lighting 3 sticks of incense before leaving without a word. She was always alone, always wearing the same red scarf her sister had once owned. In January 2016, that ritual collided with bureaucracy. A small legal article circulated online explaining China's 20-year statute of limitations for homicide prosecutions. In simple terms, if no one had been charged by the 20th anniversary, the case could never again reach court. For the first time, the words Nanjing University dismemberment case and expiration date appeared in the same sentence. The realization hit the public like thunder. Journalists called it the day justice would officially die. Within hours, the story spread across Weibo and news portals. Old photographs resurfaced: Tao Wai-ching in her student uniform, the police carrying evidence bags, the candlelight vigil outside the university gate. Citizens who hadn't even been born in 1996 reposted her image with the caption, "No statute for evil." Thousands of comments flooded in anger, disbelief, grief reborn. If time can erase murder, one user wrote, then time itself becomes the killer. The outrage reached Beijing by nightfall. Television panels debated the morality of limitation laws. Legal experts explained that statutes existed to protect defendants from indefinite uncertainty, but their words fell flat against a wave of emotion. Victims' families across the country joined the conversation, demanding reform. Hashtags calling for justice for Tao Wai-ching trended for days. People lit candles in front of Nanjing University's main gate again, exactly as they had 2 decades earlier, except this time, the flames were joined by smartphone screens glowing in unison. Faced with national pressure, the Ministry of Public Security issued a statement on social media: "No forgetting, no expiration. Investigation continues." It was short, deliberate, and instantly historic. For the first time, officials publicly acknowledged that the statute could be challenged in exceptional circumstances. The post was shared more than 2 million times in a single day. To the public, it sounded like a vow. To lawyers, it was only a promise without precedent. But to Tao Yi-hua, it was a small flicker of hope she hadn't felt in years. In the weeks that followed, reporters interviewed retired detectives from the original task force. Some confessed they still kept pieces of evidence locked away at home, scraps of reports, faded photographs, the old map with red pins. Captain Lee, now gray-haired, appeared briefly on television. When asked whether he believed the case could still be solved, he paused for a long time and said, "If the killer is alive, he remembers every cut he made. We just need him to remember out loud." Online forums exploded with amateur sleuths. Old theories resurfaced: the medical student who vanished after graduation, the anatomy lecturer dismissed quietly in '97, the maintenance worker rumored to have left for the South. None were confirmed. The more the public searched, the more the mystery deepened. Every shadow became a suspect, every silence became guilt. For the Tao family, hope came with exhaustion. Tao Yiwa wrote an open letter to the police. "We do not need revenge. We only need the truth. Even if the person confesses after death, please tell us why." Her words struck a chord with millions. It reminded people that justice was not only about punishment, but about acknowledgement, that even if time takes away the chance to convict, it should never take away the right to know. When the anniversary night finally arrived, thousands gathered outside Nanjing University. The campus was quiet, lit by paper lanterns carrying her name. Students recited her story aloud, turning history into ritual. Somewhere among them stood a young medical intern who whispered, "I study anatomy because of her." That simple confession captured the paradox of the tragedy. Knowledge had once destroyed her, but knowledge could also preserve her memory. The law eventually changed. China re-examined the statute of limitations for serious crimes, extending or abolishing it in certain cases. But no arrest followed. The Nanjing case remained open, technically alive, practically cold. Tao Yiwa stopped attending public events after that year. She told a journalist quietly, "I think my sister's resting now. Maybe that's enough." Justice had not been delivered, but something else had been achieved: a refusal to forget. The city learned that silence is not closure, and time is not forgiveness. The story of Tao I-Ching became more than a crime. It became a mirror held up to society, asking a question that still echoes through classrooms and courtrooms alike. When law runs out, what do we have left to call right? In the years after the 20th anniversary, the candles burned out and the headlines faded, but the wound remained. The Tao family had lived too long in the space between hope and despair, a place where truth was always promised but never delivered. When the courts finally reopened their doors to civil petitions, Tao Yiwa decided to file one. Her case was simple: that the university's negligence had cost her sister her life. It wasn't about money. It was about acknowledgement, a record written somewhere official that said her sister's death mattered. The petition reached the Nanjing District Court in early 2017. Journalists called it symbolic, but to the family, it was sacred. They arrived dressed in black, carrying a single photo of Tao I-Ching, the one from her student ID where she smiled, just slightly unsure of the camera. The courtroom was quiet, sterile, indifferent. Across from them sat the university's legal representatives, calm, polite, rehearsed. They expressed condolences, recited statements about the passage of time, and insisted that safety measures had improved since the 1990s. No one spoke her name aloud until Yiwa did. Her voice broke on the second syllable. The trial lasted less than 3 hours. There was no verdict, only an agreement to mediate privately. The university promised a modest compensation fund for future student safety programs and asked the family to withdraw the petition in the spirit of harmony. Yiwa signed the paper in silence. When she stepped outside, reporters crowded around her microphones, reaching like branches. She said only one sentence: justice denied is not the same as justice lost. Then she turned away and disappeared into the crowd. After that day, she withdrew from public life. The family moved back to their hometown in Tai-ho, reopening the small grocery store their parents had once run. On the counter sat a small wooden frame holding her sister's photo. Customers often left quietly after noticing it, unsure what to say. Every evening before closing, Yua wiped the glass, whispered goodnight, and locked the door. Some nights she dreamed of a phone ringing and woke reaching for it, half expecting to hear her sister's voice saying she was coming home from the library. Meanwhile, in Nanjing, the old dormitory where Tao Ching had lived was torn down during campus expansion. Construction workers unearthed the foundation stones of the original building, and for a moment the site filled with students and journalists eager to take photographs. The university issued a short statement calling it the renewal of a painful past. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The ground that once hid the truth was now being built upon layer after layer until memory itself became architecture. The unsolved case turned into curriculum. Criminology students studied it as an example of investigative limitations. Sociology students analyzed it as a failure of institutional empathy. But for those who had lived through the terror, it was still a scar invisible yet felt. Dr. Zhao, the retired pathologist, refused interviews, but sent a single letter to a journalist who had covered the case since the beginning. In it he wrote, "The longer I study death, the more I believe justice is not found in courts but in remembrance. As long as she is remembered, she has not been erased." The phrase spread online, printed on posters, shared in documentaries, carved into stone at the small memorial park near the university gate. Students left flowers there during exam weeks, not because they knew her, but because they feared becoming her, young, hopeful, and forgotten. Every generation of new freshmen heard her story from upperclassmen told in lowered voices under dormitory lights. In those retellings, the details changed, but the core never did. A girl who wanted nothing more than to study, betrayed by a world that confused intelligence with safety. 21 years after the murder, the case file still sat on a shelf marked Unsolved. Dust covered the folders, but inside the photographs had not faded. Tao Ching's eyes still stared straight ahead, patient, unblinking, as if waiting. When asked decades later whether she forgave the university or the police, Tao Yihua answered softly, "I forgive them all, but I will never forgive time." It was a sentence that carried both resignation and defiance, the paradox that defined her entire life. For most, that would be the end of the story. But in Nanjing, where memory has a way of echoing through generations, her name still finds its way into conversations between students on cold nights. They light candles, not out of superstition, but out of respect for the girl who became a lesson. Justice may have failed her, but remembrance keeps her human. And sometimes, that's all history allows. At night, when the last buses leave and the city's noise fades into the hum of distant traffic, there is a certain silence that hangs over Nanjing University. Locals say it's the kind of quiet that feels alive, as if the air itself remembers. Security guards doing late rounds avoid the old pathways that once led to the demolished dormitory. They say the streetlights there flicker, even when the wiring is new, that sometimes a shadow passes across the pavement when no one's walking. No one believes in ghosts until they find a story that refuses to die. More than 25 years have passed since the murder of Tao Ching, yet her presence lingers not in superstition, but in ritual. Every January, small candles appear outside the east gate, no fanfare, no announcement, just quiet points of light trembling against the wind. Students who leave them often don't know the full story. They've only heard fragments from older classmates passed down like an inheritance. A girl disappeared, they're told, and no one was ever caught. The crime, they say, changed how the city slept. The administration has tried to move forward. The new buildings gleam with glass and steel, a vision of modern education. Security cameras line every hall, access cards track every entry. But the more technology improves, the more human memory rebels. Teachers still pause when that name surfaces in lectures, and the older janitors, those who remember the winter of 1996, still leave the hall lights on longer than necessary. The ghost of Nanjing isn't a spirit, it's a feeling, a collective unease that knowledge alone couldn't save her. Visitors to the memorial park near the gate often find folded paper cranes beside the stone bearing her name. No one organizes it, but every year they multiply. Some are made from notebook pages torn from lecture notes. Others are cut from bus tickets or receipts, small pieces of everyday life turned into remembrance. The message is always the same: you were one of us. For many, her story became more than an unsolved crime. It became a mirror for the nation itself, its progress, its failures, its uneasy balance between reason and empathy. Students who study forensic science here talk about her case the way doctors talk about anatomy, with reverence for the lesson and sorrow for the subject. Without her, one graduate once said, we might have forgotten that law is made of people, not just rules. The Tao family eventually faded from public view. Tao Yiwa, now in her 50s, lives quietly in Taiho, her grocery store still open, her hair now streaked with gray. She rarely gives interviews, but when she does, her words are measured. People ask if I believe my sister's soul still walks there, she said once, smiling faintly. I think she never left, but not as a ghost. She lives in those who remember her kindly. And perhaps she does. The legacy of Tao I Ching isn't horror, it's endurance. Her story has inspired documentaries, novels, even an ethics course titled The Weight of Innocence. Through every retelling, she transforms from victim to symbol, from silence to echo. There's a saying among Nanjing students: if you study late and feel someone behind you, don't be afraid. It's only her reminding you to go home safe. When night settles over the campus and fog rolls in from the river, the city feels suspended between past and present. Somewhere a student closes a book, extinguishes a lamp, and walks down the corridor lit by yellow light. In that stillness, beneath layers of time and progress, the memory of Tao I Ching walks with them, not to frighten, but to remind. Because evil, no matter how precise, is never truly perfect. It always leaves something behind, a trace, a question, a name whispered decades later. And in that whisper, the ghost of Nanjing lives on. The morning of July 7th, 2015 began like any other in Chontan district. The air was thick with humidity, cicadas already buzzing across the rubber plantations, and families opening their shop doors to the rhythm of another working day. At number 71 National Highway 13, the Villa Kwok family home stood behind its white iron gate, quiet, immaculate, and for the first time in years, completely still. By 7 a.m., a neighbor noticed something odd. The metal gate was unlocked, and the family's delivery truck hadn't left for the factory. She called out, expecting someone to answer. Silence. When curiosity turned to unease, she pushed the gate open, walked to the front door, and found it ajar. Inside, the air smelled of metal, and something worse: sweet, heavy, unmistakable. In the living room, she saw them. 6 bodies scattered in eerie calm, as if frozen mid-conversation. A father, a mother, two children, and two relatives, all murdered with the precision of someone who had planned every second. The neighbor screamed, and that sound shattered the quiet morning. Within minutes, the entire street filled with people, whispers, and disbelief. In a town where everyone knew everyone, the unimaginable had just happened inside the most respected family's home. The victims were members of the Lu Van Mai family, owners of a small but successful wood processing business. Lu Van Mai 50 and his wife Duong T Mai 44 were known for their kindness and generosity. Their daughter Leon Lin 22 managed the family's affairs with calm intelligence. The couple's younger children, just 13 and 11, were still in school. They lived comfortably but modestly, employing local workers and helping families in need. No one in Bin Phuc could name a single person who disliked them. That made what came next even harder to believe. When police arrived, they were met with a scene so methodical it felt ritualistic. The front door showed no sign of forced entry. The victims' phones and valuables remained untouched. Each person had been bound with nylon rope, gagged and killed quietly with a single stab wound to the throat. There were no defensive marks, no overturned furniture, no signs of struggle. Whoever committed the murders had moved through the house like a shadow, certain of every step, certain of their victims. Detectives sealed off the property as the news spread through Bin Phuc province. Crowds gathered along the highway, held back by yellow tape, whispering prayers. Reporters arrived before noon, cameras flashing against the pale walls. In the afternoon heat, the family's relatives wept outside the gate, their voices echoing through the neighborhood. "How can one person hate so much?" an aunt cried. But this wasn't hate, it was something colder. By the second day, investigators had pieced together a rough timeline. The family's security guard had left early that night to take his wife to the hospital, leaving the gate unlocked around 3 a.m. A motorcycle was heard near the entrance, but no one thought much of it. The killer or killers entered through the front, subduing each family member one by one. They worked quickly, leaving before sunrise. The crime was discovered 4 hours later, when the first worker arrived to open the factory. The case stunned Vietnam. Television anchors spoke in subdued tones, newspapers printed black borders around their headlines, and social media erupted in grief. Thousands traveled to the funeral, standing under umbrellas as 6 coffins lined up side by side. Some fainted, others simply stood in silence, heads bowed. The sound of chanting mixed with the hum of reporters' microphones. For days, the entire nation seemed to hold its breath. In Bin Phuc, people locked their doors earlier, checked on neighbors, and prayed for the souls lost in what became known as Vụ Thảm Sát Bin Phuc, the Bin Phuc massacre. The brutality was shocking enough, but the lack of motive made it unbearable. Who would kill 6 people, including children, and take nothing? Police launched the largest manhunt in provincial history. Over 300 officers combed the district, questioning workers, scanning phone records, reviewing CCTV footage from nearby gas stations. 2 days later, a single clue surfaced, a shoe print near the side gate partially smeared with engine oil. It matched the brand worn by a 24-year-old man named Nguyen Hai Duong, a former employee, and more importantly, the ex-boyfriend of the family's eldest daughter, Le-An Lin. By the time police knocked on his door, Duong was calm, cooperative, almost indifferent. "I heard about it," he said softly. "Terrible." He agreed to come to the station for questions. Sitting under the flickering light of the interrogation room, he didn't fidget or sweat. He simply looked down at his hands and said, "I want to help you find who did this." But investigators could already feel it, the stillness of guilt disguised as control. The house of silence had found its echo inside him. Long before the murders, the Lu Van Mai family were known in Bin Phuoc not for their wealth, but for their kindness. They lived in a two-story villa just off Highway 13, its front yard shaded by flowering trees and the steady hum of machinery from the family's wood processing factory next door. Every morning the gate opened at 6 and the smell of sawdust mixed with breakfast from the kitchen. Workers began their shifts with bowls of pho provided by Mrs. Duong Thi Mai, who insisted that no one start the day hungry. Neighbors often said the family had everything: stability, respect, and hearts too generous for their own safety. Mr. Mai 50 had come from humble beginnings. As a young man, he had spent years hauling timber through the forests before saving enough to start his own workshop. His hands, thick and scarred, never stopped moving even after success came. People trusted him because he treated business like friendship. When the factory grew, he employed relatives and locals who needed work paying more than the standard rate. "If you help others, you never go poor," he liked to say. His wife Mai was the calm anchor behind that philosophy. She managed the family's accounts with quiet precision, making sure every worker was paid on time and every loan repaid. Together, they built not only a company, but a community that relied on their decency. Their eldest daughter, Lei Anlin, 22, had inherited her mother's discipline and her father's warmth. After studying business in Ho Chi Minh City, she returned home to help modernize the family factory. She was the kind of person who spoke softly but decisively, who could settle disputes between workers with a smile. Those who knew her said she had a sense of responsibility far beyond her age. Her parents often joked that she was the real boss. Behind her success, though, was a heartbreak. She rarely mentioned a relationship that had ended months earlier with a young man named Nguyen Hai Duong. Duong had been introduced to the family by Lin herself. At first, they had welcomed him like a son, an ambitious worker, polite and eager to please. He shared meals with them, called Mrs. My auntie, and earned trust quickly. But when the romance soured, his charm curdled into resentment. The breakup, though quiet, left him bitter. Lin's family encouraged her to move on, believing kindness would dissolve anger. They had no idea that kindness would be mistaken for weakness. The younger children, aged 13 and 11, were the light of the household. They filled the villa with laughter, chasing each other through the long corridors after dinner. The boy Tuan dreamed of becoming a pilot. His sister Diem wanted to be a painter. Their mother hung the children's drawings on the refrigerator, a collage of bright skies and smiling faces. At night, the family gathered in the living room, watching television while their father dozed on the couch. To anyone looking in from outside, it was the image of peace. The family's faith in safety was absolute. They believed in the small-town rule that decency protected you, that good deeds built invisible walls stronger than any lock. Their home's gate was rarely closed during the day. Workers came and went freely, some even keeping spare keys to storage rooms. The villa's security camera pointed at the gate hadn't worked in months, but no one thought to repair it. Nothing bad had ever happened here, and nothing ever would, or so they believed. Neighbors often recalled how in the weeks before the tragedy, the Lu family hosted a small gathering to celebrate their daughter's birthday. The courtyard glowed with paper lanterns, and laughter spilled into the street. Even Duong attended briefly, arriving with a small gift and a polite smile that seemed to smooth over the past. To outsiders, it looked like reconciliation. In truth, it was the rehearsal for something darker. That night, as the family toasted to a future none of them would live to see, Duong stood silently by the fence, his eyes distant. In the final days before the murders, nothing seemed unusual. Mr. Mai inspected a new shipment of wood. Lin discussed expansion plans with a partner in Ho Chi Minh City. The children practiced for a school performance. And Mrs., my ever meticulous, prepared pay envelopes for her employees. The only hint of unease came from a housekeeper who recalled Lynn saying she'd had a strange feeling lately that someone had been watching the villa from across the road. Probably just my imagination, she laughed. The woman nodded and forgot about it. Kindness had protected them for years, but it also blinded them. They treated everyone as friend, including the man who would return not as a guest, but as their executioner. The night of July 6, 2015 began quietly. In Bin Phuc, the air hung heavy with heat and crickets sang from the dark edges of the rubber fields. Inside the Lu Van Mai villa, the family prepared for bed. The youngest children had fallen asleep, first curled up under thin blankets. Mrs. Mai checked the locks, turned off the lights, and laid out the next morning's clothes for work. Her husband stayed up late reviewing paperwork from the factory, a habit she often teased him about. By 11:30, the house was still, its windows glowing faintly from the television in the living room. Outside, 2 motorcycles idled near the edge of the property, their engines muted. Nguyen Hai Duong sat at the front, his face hidden beneath a black cap. Beside him was his accomplice Vu Von Tien, a quiet friend who owed him a favor and didn't know how deep the favor would go. Duong's plan had been rehearsed for weeks: enter silently, subdue the family, steal money, and if necessary erase witnesses. He carried rope, gloves, and a knife wrapped in cloth. To him, it wasn't rage. It was precision. He had drawn a map of the villa, from memory, every door and hallway marked. He knew who slept where. He knew how long it would take. At 1:30 a.m., they slipped through the gate, left unlocked after the guard's early departure. Duong's familiarity with the house made every step easy. He moved first to the main hall, testing the light switches to ensure they were off. Then he signaled Tien, who hesitated, whispering that they could still leave. "Too late," Duong replied. His voice was flat, almost serene. He opened the first door. The victims never had a chance. Duong moved from room to room, binding their hands with nylon rope, covering their mouths with tape. He spoke softly, almost kindly, telling them it would be quick. "Mr." Mai tried to resist but was struck down before he could shout. Lin, seeing the knife, pleaded for her family. She recognized his voice, called him by name, and begged him to stop. For a moment, witnesses would later say it seemed as though he might. But then something in his expression changed, a flicker of the rejection he had never forgiven. The knife descended, once, then again. By 2 a.m., 6 lives had been taken in near silence. Duong and Tien wiped the blades, collected a few envelopes of cash, and walked calmly back toward the motorcycles. The only sound that followed them was the soft thud of a closing gate. The massacre had lasted less than 40 minutes. The next morning, sunlight fell across the white tile floors, illuminating the stillness. The family's driver arrived at 6:30, puzzled to find the gate ajar and the delivery truck unmoved. He called out, "Mr. Mai." No response. When he stepped inside, he froze. The air was dense, metallic, almost liquid. He saw the bodies first in the living room, the parents side by side, and then the trail that led down the corridor to the bedrooms. He staggered outside, screaming until neighbors came running. Within minutes, the quiet street turned into chaos. Police arrived within the hour. The crime scene was a study in order and violence. No signs of struggle, no missing valuables, except a few bills. Forensics noted that the killer had wiped down surfaces and locked one of the bedroom doors from the inside, perhaps to delay discovery. The investigators worked methodically, photographing every room, collecting fingerprints, lifting shoe prints from the floor. The first clue, a faint smear of engine oil near the gate, was dismissed until later that day, when an officer recalled that Dung used to repair his own motorbike in that very courtyard. By noon, the provincial authorities had declared a state of emergency. News of the massacre swept across Vietnam, dominating every television broadcast. The faces of the 6 victims appeared on screens nationwide. People wept openly at the sight of the 2 youngest, their school uniforms displayed beside their coffins. The brutality seemed beyond comprehension. This was not random, one official said during a press briefing. It was personal. For the residents of Bin Phuc, the villa became a shrine of fear. People gathered outside the gates, lighting incense and whispering prayers, some leaving food offerings for the children's spirits. Reporters stood among them, cameras aimed at the locked house, describing every grim detail. That evening, under a sky streaked with fading light, the coffins were carried out one by one. The sound of weeping followed them down the street like an unending echo. Duong watched the funeral coverage from a cafe miles away, his face expressionless, stirring his coffee until it turned cold. When a friend remarked on the tragedy, he nodded and said they were good people. Then he smiled faintly, a gesture that would later haunt the police officers who saw him after his arrest. Even then, the calm had not left him. The man who once shared dinner with that family had turned their home into silence, and in that silence, he found a perverse kind of peace. By the second day, Bin Phuc province had turned into a fortress of flashing lights and barricades. More than 200 officers filled the small district, combing every field, every roadside cafe, every corner of the highway that stretched past the Lu Van Mai villa. The police chief, Colonel Chen Ngoc Hent, arrived from Ho Chi Minh City before dawn. He stood in front of the house, the smell of decay still thick in the humid air, and told reporters only one thing: "We will not rest until we know who did this." His words echoed across the province like a promise carved in stone. Inside the villa, forensic teams worked methodically. They photographed every inch marked blood droplets and collected footprints preserved in dust. There were no signs of forced entry, no ransacked rooms, no missing valuables, only meticulous violence. The nylon ropes used to tie the victims were standard industrial type, available everywhere. The knife had been wiped clean, but a trace of motor oil on the handle caught an officer's attention. Nearby, a faint shoe print led toward the gate. It was partial blurred but unique. A small worn patch on the heel matched a style of sneaker common among local motorbike riders. Captain Phan Min, one of the lead investigators, began reconstructing the night minute by minute. He listed the few facts they had. The security guard had left around midnight. Neighbors heard motorcycles between 1 and 2 a.m. The family's dog had barked once, then gone silent. And by dawn, the house had become a tomb. This wasn't random, Min said. They knew this house. They knew who was inside. As news spread, the country erupted in grief and anger. People demanded answers not just from police, but from fate itself. On television, psychologists debated motives. Was it revenge? Was it robbery gone wrong? The questions felt endless. Social media burned with speculation, some posts accusing gangs, others blaming supernatural forces. But behind the noise, investigators already suspected something simpler and darker: familiarity. They began interviewing everyone connected to the Liu family, workers, relatives, and friends. It didn't take long before a name kept surfacing in quiet tones: Nguyen Hai Duong. He had dated the eldest daughter, Lian Lin, for 2 years before being asked to leave the family business after their breakup. Most said he'd taken it well. Some weren't so sure. One factory worker recalled seeing him parked near the villa a few nights before the murders. He just sat there, the man said, smoking, watching the house. When asked why he hadn't reported it sooner, the worker looked down and whispered, "Because I didn't think someone so polite could do something like that." Meanwhile, Doong himself watched the coverage with unsettling composure. He appeared on social media, offering condolences, writing, "I pray for their souls." It fooled many. But one detail betrayed him: the timestamp of his posts. They had been made at hours matching key movements of the investigation, as though he wanted to insert himself into the timeline. By July 9th, officers were tailing him discreetly. They observed how he lingered near the police perimeter, asking casual questions, offering to help. When investigators invited him in for formal questioning, he didn't resist. At the station, he sat quietly across from Captain Min, his posture relaxed. "You were close to the family?" Min asked. "Yes," Doong replied. "They treated me like their own." The captain studied his face. No tremor, no sign of fear. But there was something too controlled about his calm, a stillness that felt rehearsed. As interrogation continued, inconsistencies began to appear. Doong claimed he'd been home the entire night of the murders, watching television with friends. When police checked, one of those friends couldn't confirm the timeline. "He left for a bit," the man admitted, said he needed air. That statement cracked the facade. The motorbike he used matched the tire tracks found outside the villa. A search of his apartment turned up nylon rope gloves and a small sum of cash tied with the same red string used by Mrs. Mai for the factory payroll. When confronted with the evidence, Doong didn't panic. He simply looked down, sighed, and said, "You already know." It was neither confession nor denial, just acknowledgement. For the officers who had spent days sifting through horror, that moment felt like the breath before a storm. By the time the official announcement came that night, Vietnam's televisions glowed with one headline: "Suspect arrested in Binh Phuc family massacre." Crowds gathered outside police stations to hear more faces lit by phone screens. The relief was mixed with rage. People wanted to know why, how, and whether anyone else had helped. The nation had found its suspect, but the question that haunted every viewer remained: what could turn a quiet young man, once welcomed as family, into the author of such darkness? When investigators replayed the confession, the details sounded rehearsed, almost clinical. Nguyen Hai Duong spoke without hesitation, describing each movement through the villa, as if reading from a script he had memorized. His tone carried neither guilt nor pride, just precision. He remembered which lights were on, how many steps between rooms, how long it took for the rope to tighten. Every second felt measured. To the detectives listening, it became clear this wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. It was premeditation, pure and cold. Over the next week, the task force reconstructed the crime from beginning to end. They followed his route using his own diagrams: where he parked the motorcycle, where he paused to test the door, where he whispered to his accomplice to stay calm. Forensic markers lined the hallways like a macabre map, each red flag marking a decision. What shocked investigators most wasn't the brutality, but the composure. Doong had committed 6 murders in under 40 minutes without a single neighbor hearing a scream. It was as if he had rehearsed silence. Psychologists brought in to evaluate him found contradictions everywhere. He spoke about the victims in familiar tones, calling them by nicknames, referring to Mr. Mai as uncle. Yet in the same breath, he justified killing them. "They made me feel small," he said. They took away everything I built. When asked why he included the children, his answer was chillingly calm, because they would have recognized me. Meanwhile, his accomplice Vu Van Tien broke down completely. He wept during questioning, describing how he had tried to stop Duong halfway through the crime. He told me it was too late, Tien said. He said we had already crossed the line. His testimony painted a portrait of manipulation of a man who knew exactly how to bend others to his will. When officers asked Tien why he didn't run, he replied, because he made me believe there was no way out. Back in the interrogation room, Duong began to test boundaries. He corrected investigators on small details, asked about media coverage, and even requested to see photographs of the crime scene to confirm accuracy. Captain Min denied the request, but noted the phrasing. He wants control, the captain said. Even here, he's trying to edit the story. The police decided to confront him with Tien's confession. When they played the recording, Duong listened quietly, tapping his finger on the table in rhythm with the words. When it ended, he smiled faintly. He talks too much, he said. But yes, that's what happened. The following day, the police reenacted the crime under supervision, with Duong guiding officers through the villa. Television crews filmed from a distance as he demonstrated the sequence of events step by step. He pointed to the exact spot where he tied each victim, explaining his movements with unnerving composure. Some officers turned away, unable to watch. The footage later broadcast on national TV drew millions of viewers and a collective shudder. It wasn't just the violence, it was how ordinary he looked doing it. As the investigation reached its final phase, the scope of planning became undeniable. Duong had visited the villa twice before the murders, scouting entrances, testing lights, and calculating escape routes. He had even practiced tying knots to make sure they held without leaving marks on his hands. Psychologists called it a crime of control. To him, the killings were not revenge, they were reclamation. By ending their lives, he thought he was reclaiming power he'd lost when Lin rejected him. Public outrage grew louder. People across Vietnam demanded the death penalty. The case consumed television debates and newspapers, turning Duong into a symbol of moral collapse. Some commentators called him the smiling killer, referencing his expression during the reenactment. Others questioned what created a man like him, whether it was poverty, humiliation, or something colder born inside him long before that night. In late July, the official charges were announced: premeditated, murder, robbery, and unlawful entry. Duong signed the documents without argument, only asking one question: can I write a letter to her parents? The request stunned the officers. He claimed he wanted forgiveness, but when the letter was read, it contained no apology, only a line that said, "I wish we could go back to before everything changed." The trap had closed completely. Every word, every calculation that once gave him control now became evidence against him. And for the first time since his arrest, when the door to his cell clanged shut behind him, Nguyen Hai Duong looked up and blinked rapidly, as though the realization had finally reached him that no plan, however perfect, could account for the weight of 6 lives lost forever. The final confession came quietly late in the evening of July 10th. The rain outside had stopped hours earlier, leaving the interrogation room wrapped in the damp stillness of night. Nguyen Hai Duong sat across from Captain Min once again, his wrists resting on the table, his gaze fixed on the dull reflection of the fluorescent light above him. He no longer pretended innocence. What remained was the strange calm of a man who had accepted that his story was finished. "I killed them all," he said. The words landed without drama spoken, almost as an afterthought. Min didn't move. He simply asked, "Why?" Dung leaned back in his chair and took a slow breath. Because they treated me like nothing, he said. They let me believe I belonged, then threw me away. He described the months after his breakup with Lian Lin, the humiliation, the rumors, the feeling that everyone in Bin Phirk had watched him fall from grace. They said I wasn't good enough for her, he whispered. I wanted to show them I wasn't weak. His reasoning was circular, self-justifying, and devoid of empathy. Each word revealed not remorse, but obsession with control. He spoke of love as ownership of betrayal, as a debt that had to be paid in blood. When he described the moment he entered the house, he said it felt like walking into a dream, already decided. The officers in the room, hardened by years of experience, felt something deeper than disgust, a cold understanding of how easily rational thought can dissolve into delusion. As he recounted the killings, his voice never rose. He described each victim by name, acknowledging them as though recounting a memory of dinner guests rather than the dead. When asked about the children, he paused for a long time before answering. They woke up, he said. I didn't plan to hurt them. But if they screamed, everything would fall apart. He looked down at his hands then, for the first time since his arrest, and whispered, I didn't want to hear them cry. It was the only moment his composure cracked. Not regret, just the faint tremor of someone realizing that silence had finally turned against him. Investigators let him talk. He explained how he had prepared for weeks, studying the family's habits, memorizing their routines, and timing the absence of the security guard. He practiced tying knots and wiping fingerprints. It had to be perfect, he said. If you plan something for long enough, you start believing it's already done. The precision was frightening, not because of its logic, but because of its emptiness. Captain Min leaned forward. You loved her, he asked. Duong smiled faintly. Of course, he replied. That's why I couldn't let her live without me. The answer left the room silent. It was the twisted echo of every story about obsession disguised as devotion. The detectives wrote down the sentence, aware that it summed up the entire tragedy. Love in his mind wasn't connection, it was possession. And when possession was lost, destruction became the only way to feel whole again. After the confession, he signed the papers with slow, deliberate strokes. When he finished, he looked up and said, I hope they understand. Min asked who he meant. The family, he answered. Maybe in the next life, they'll see it differently. Outside the station, news of his full confession spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered through the night, holding candles, chanting prayers for the victims. On television, anchors spoke in muted tones, reading his statements aloud. People listened, horrified but transfixed. It was not just the scale of the crime that shocked them, it was the ordinariness of the man who committed it. By morning, Duong was transferred to a high-security detention center. Reporters captured his image as he stepped from the police van, head bowed, handcuffed, still calm. Someone in the crowd shouted his name, but he didn't flinch. The cameras caught his face, expressionless, unrepentant, and that photograph became the defining image of the case. What the public didn't see were the final words he spoke to his guard that morning. As they walked down the corridor toward his cell, he said softly, It's strange how quiet it feels now. The guard didn't answer. For the first time in weeks, Duong had no one left to manipulate, no story left to tell. The silence he had forced upon others had finally become his own. The trial began on December 17, 2015, under the sweltering heat of southern Vietnam. By sunrise, crowds had already gathered outside the Bin Phiruk Provincial People's Court, lining the sidewalks with umbrellas and hand-painted signs demanding justice. Reporters filled every corner of the courtyard, their cameras aimed at the iron gates. Inside, rows of police officers stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces unreadable. The courthouse buzzed with anticipation, the kind that precedes both judgment and spectacle. Nguyen Haidung entered the courtroom wearing a pale blue prison uniform. His hands were cuffed, but his posture remained upright. Behind him, his accomplice Vu Van Tien followed with eyes downcast, trembling. The moment Duong appeared, the crowd erupted not in chaos but in collective rage. Mothers wept openly. Fathers clenched their fists. For months, the country had waited for this moment, and now the man responsible for 6 deaths stood within reach of the law. Inside, the courtroom was filled beyond capacity. Every seat was taken by victims' relatives, journalists, and members of the public who had queued overnight. The air was heavy, thick with heat and grief. The judges entered, 3 of them robes dark against the bright wood of the panel. When the lead judge called the session to order, even the air seemed to hold its breath. The prosecution began by outlining the sequence of events, the planning, the execution, and the cold precision of Duong's crime. They presented photographs, forensic charts, and the handwritten confession signed in blue ink. Each piece of evidence built a wall of inevitability around the defendant. He entered their home, knowing they would die, the prosecutor said. He calculated each move, each breath. This was not impulse, it was design. When the witnesses spoke, the room shifted from anger to sorrow. Factory workers described how the Liu family treated them like kin. The family's relatives recalled the morning they discovered the bodies. The driver who found them cried as he tried to speak. Even seasoned journalists lowered their cameras, unable to keep filming. When it was Duong's turn to speak, he rose calmly. His voice was clear, deliberate, almost polite. "I know what I did," he said. "No one can forgive it. But I want people to understand that I didn't plan to kill them all." Gasps rippled through the audience. The judge raised a hand for silence. Duong continued, "I went there to take money. But when I saw her, everything I had buried came back." He paused, his tone flat. It wasn't anger, it was emptiness. The prosecutor stepped forward. "You call that emptiness," he said, "but you brought rope, knives, and gloves. You planned escape routes. You left nothing to chance. That is not emptiness, that is calculation." Duong looked at him, expression unchanged, and replied, "Maybe they're the same thing." The answer stunned the room. For a moment, even the judge hesitated, unsure whether it was cynicism or confession. Throughout the day, Tien sat silently beside his former friend. When the judge asked if he had anything to add, he whispered, "I wish I had never known him." Those words broke what little composure remained among the spectators. Outside the courthouse, people chanted for the death penalty. Inside, the air vibrated with the inevitability of it. The verdict came after only 1 day of deliberation. Guilty on all counts: premeditated murder, armed robbery, and illegal entry. The sentence: death by lethal injection. When the words were spoken, the crowd exhaled as one, a sound that was neither joy nor relief, but exhaustion. The judge read slowly, his voice echoing off the wooden walls. The accused Nguyen Haidung acted with cruelty, with planning, and with full awareness of his actions. His crimes have caused irreparable loss to society and to the families of the victims. The court sentences him to death. There was no outburst, no applause, only silence. Even Duong stood still, nodding once as though acknowledging the conclusion of something he had long known was coming. Tien was sentenced to life imprisonment for his role as an accomplice. After the trial, the victims' relatives left the courthouse quietly. Reporters surrounded them, but most refused to speak. One woman, a cousin of the Liu family, finally said, "Justice doesn't bring them back. But at least now the silence has a name. Her words captured what many felt, that the verdict, though final, could never balance the scales. As dusk fell, the crowd dispersed. The courthouse returned to stillness. In his holding cell, Doong sat on his bunk, staring at the wall. When the guard asked if he wanted dinner, he shook his head. "It's strange," he murmured. "Everything feels lighter now." The guard didn't reply. Outside, the sky turned red over Bin Phurk, and for the first time in months, the town slept without fear, though not without memory. At dawn on November 17, 2017, the gates of Chihoa prison opened under a gray sky. A convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled out toward the Bin Phurk Provincial Detention Center. Inside, one of them sat Nguyen Hai Duong, dressed in the same pale blue uniform he had worn at trial. His wrists were shackled, his expression calm. For most prisoners, the final morning is a storm of panic pleas for mercy, tears, prayers. For Duong, it was just another appointment kept on time. He had been informed of his execution date a week earlier. When the warden read him the notice, he nodded once and said, "Thank you for telling me early." Since then, he had spent his days reading Buddhist texts, eating little, sleeping less. The guard said he spoke politely, asked for nothing, and never showed anger. He seemed to be saving energy, one officer recalled later, like he wanted to walk to his death without making a sound. At 5:45 a.m., he was escorted to the small chamber inside the provincial prison. 3 officers stood beside a table covered in documents. The executioner read the order aloud, his voice echoing against the concrete walls. The People's Court of Bin Phurk sentences Nguyen Hai Duong to death by lethal injection. The words hung heavy in the air. Duong listened without expression. When asked if he had any final words, he replied, "I want to say sorry, but I know it means nothing." He turned his head slightly toward the window, where a thin beam of sunlight cut through the bars. "Please tell her family I understand now," he said quietly. "Love is not ownership, it's letting go." The officers wrote it down in the record, though none were sure if it was confession, wisdom, or performance. Moments later, the procedure began. 3 injections, sedative, paralytic, and cardiac stop. His body relaxed, eyes half open. The heart monitor pulsed once, twice, then went flat. Time of death, 6:09 a.m. Outside, the prison crowds had gathered since early morning. Some prayed, others simply watched in silence, unsure what justice should feel like. Reporters were not allowed inside, but within an hour, the news broke. Execution carried out. Television anchors read the statement with solemn voices. Across Vietnam, households stopped mid-breakfast to watch. Social media filled with a strange mixture of relief and melancholy. One post went viral, "Justice done but no peace restored." The victims' relatives refused interviews that day. They stayed home, lighting incense before the family altar. For them, the punishment had never been about revenge, it was about closure that still felt unreachable. "When they die," one cousin said, "we don't get our family back. We just stop hearing their names in the news." In the Liu family's old factory, now operated by distant relatives, workers stopped the machines for a minute of silence. The hum of motors faded into stillness, the same kind that had filled the house 2 years before. In prison records, Duong's behavior during his final hours was described as cooperative, calm, reflective. Guards who escorted him to the chamber said he smiled faintly when he saw the injection table. One whispered afterward, "It was like he thought he deserved it." Perhaps he did. Perhaps he just wanted to end the story before the world wrote its own ending for him. That night, a light rain fell over Bin Phurk. The streets glistened under the lamps, and the town slept early. In the cemetery where the Liu family rested, candles flickered beneath plastic covers, protecting the flames from the wind. There was no celebration, no vengeance, just quiet remembrance. Evil had been punished, but the emptiness it left behind remained vast and unfillable. In the years since documentaries, books, and lectures have dissected the case from every angle. Psychologists call it a study in obsession. Criminologists call it the perfect failure of empathy. But for those who still drive past the old villa, its windows long bricked over the memory is simpler. It's the story of a family who believed kindness could protect them, and a man who mistook love for possession. And every July when the anniversary arrives, someone always leaves a bouquet of white lilies at the gate. No note, no name, just flowers and silence. In the years that followed, the name Nguyen Hai Dung faded from headlines, but never from memory. The Binh Phuoc massacre became more than a crime story. It became a mirror reflecting the frailty of trust in ordinary life. For those who lived through it, the horror was not the violence itself, but how easily it had entered through an unlocked gate. The villa still stood for a time after the murders, its paint peeling, its windows boarded. Locals avoided the street after dark, crossing to the opposite side without looking back. Some said they could still smell burnt incense in the air, even when no shrine was near. By 2020, the property had been demolished. The land remained empty for years, bought and sold, but never built upon. People called it cursed ground, though others said it was simply sacred, a place where silence deserved to stay. The workers who once opened the factory beside it refused to return, claiming that even the sound of machinery reminded them of screams. Yet, as time passed, the story transformed from fear into lesson. Teachers used it to speak about empathy, journalists wrote about the psychology of control, and families used it as a quiet warning to their children. Evil doesn't always come from strangers. In Binh Phuoc, a small memorial appeared one summer, a single plaque engraved with 6 names, no statues, no ceremony, just a square of polished stone beside a rubber tree, the kind that bleeds when cut. Visitors left flowers there every July, some praying, others just standing in silence. It wasn't about superstition, it was about remembering that kindness can coexist with danger, and that love, when twisted by ego, becomes something monstrous. Nationwide, the case forced uncomfortable conversations. People asked what had created Duong, a man who had been loved, educated, and welcomed into the very home he destroyed. Was it heartbreak, pride, or something simpler, the human capacity to believe that possession equals affection? Psychologists warned that obsession disguised as devotion is the seed of violence. Clergy spoke about forgiveness, yet no sermon could bridge the distance between the dead and the living. Documentaries replayed his final words, the ones he spoke before execution. Love is not ownership, it's letting go. Some saw repentance in them. Others heard manipulation, one last attempt to control how history would remember him, but perhaps both were true. Monsters rarely see themselves as monsters. They see themselves as victims of a world that refused to understand their pain. For the families who lost everything, peace never arrived fully. Grief doesn't vanish, it changes shape. One of Mr. Mai's surviving relatives once said in an interview, "We still set 6 places at the table every New Year. It's our way of saying they're not gone, just away for a while." The simplicity of that ritual carried more meaning than any verdict ever could. The Binh Phuoc massacre taught an entire nation that evil can hide behind a familiar smile, that safety built on trust can crumble overnight, and that the line between love and hatred is thinner than anyone dares to admit. It reminded people that cruelty doesn't always announce itself with rage. Sometimes it enters quietly, saying thank you, asking for forgiveness, and locking the door behind it. When night falls over Binfjörk, now the rubber trees sway under the weight of wind. The air smells of soil and smoke, and somewhere in that stillness, memory breathes. The old road where the villa once stood is just another stretch of asphalt, but those who pass it say the silence there feels heavier, as if the earth itself remembers what happened. And maybe that's the only kind of justice that lasts, the memory that refuses to die. On a humid August morning in Tokyo, a maintenance worker unlocked the door to apartment 503 of the Hinode Tower complex after neighbors complained about a strange odor. The building was quiet, the kind of modern high-rise where residents kept to themselves, each door identical, each hallway washed in soft fluorescent light. He knocked twice, called out in Japanese that he was entering for inspection, and turned the key. The lock clicked. The air that greeted him was stale, warm, and heavy. Inside the apartment was immaculate, no overturned furniture, no signs of struggle, no broken glass. But in the center of the living room, a single pair of shoes sat neatly on the floor beside a cold cup of coffee, as though someone had stepped out for a moment and never returned. The tenant, 42-year-old Kenji Sato, had not been seen for 4 days. His phone was found on the table, battery drained. His wallet, passport, and keys were all inside. The front door had been locked from the inside, the chain still latched. Every window was sealed, and the balcony overlooked a sheer drop 50 meters down. The apartment was a perfect box, airtight, inescapable. Yet its only resident had vanished. Detectives from the Tokyo Metropolitan Police arrived within the hour. They photographed everything from the half-empty water bottle on the counter to the faint ring of condensation left by the cup. There were no fingerprints other than Sato's. The surveillance footage from the hallway showed him entering the apartment at 10:42 p.m. on August 4th carrying groceries. No one entered or left afterward. The building's cameras never captured him again. It was in every sense an impossible disappearance. Sato was an unremarkable man by all accounts. A mid-level accountant for a shipping company, he lived alone, paid bills on time, and rarely socialized. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, the kind of man who bowed in elevators and forgot moments later that anyone else existed. His family lived in Saitama and spoke to him weekly. When he stopped answering calls, they assumed he was working overtime. Only after 4 days of silence did his younger sister file a missing person report. As investigators combed through the apartment, they found subtle signs that something was wrong. The calendar on his desk was marked up to August 4th. The next day's square was blank. His computer was powered on an unfinished email still open on the screen. It read only 3 words: "They found me." Forensic technicians traced no drafts, no contacts, no sent messages. The line stood alone, unsent and unsaved. Detective Hiroshi Tanaka, a veteran of the homicide division, led the case. He had seen hundreds of crime scenes, but this one unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. "It feels like he evaporated," he said, quietly scanning the empty space. Like he wanted to leave, but the room wouldn't let him. His team checked air vents, crawl spaces, even the plumbing systems that ran beneath the floor. Nothing. No secret passage, no hidden escape. Then came the detail that deepened the mystery. The apartment's digital lock log showed no entries after 10:42 p.m. The chain was still secured when police arrived, which meant no one could have entered from outside and no one could have left without unlocking it from within. The only possible explanation was one that made no sense, that Sato had somehow vanished while the room remained sealed. The media descended instantly. Headlines labeled it the apartment of shadows, and television crews camped outside the building. Internet forums exploded with theories: alien abduction, time slip, murder by teleportation. Others claimed it was a suicide, though no body had been found. The story gripped Japan for weeks, a perfect cocktail of fear and fascination. Inside the investigation unit, Tanaka refused to believe in the impossible. He ordered a complete forensic sweep, including ultraviolet scans, floorboard removal, and fingerprint dusting on every surface. Still, there was nothing: no trace of blood, no sign of forced entry, no clue of departure. Only one anomaly stood out. The building's power log recorded a short, unexplained surge in electricity at 10:47 p.m., exactly 5 minutes after Sato entered his apartment. Whatever happened, it happened then. Late that night, as Tanaka stood in the doorway of the sealed apartment, he stared at the shoes still sitting by the table. "People don't just disappear," he muttered. "Someone made him vanish." But the question wasn't how, it was who. And somewhere in the shadows of Tokyo, that answer was waiting, silent, patient, and unseen. Before his name became a mystery whispered across Japan, Kenji Sato lived a life so ordinary it almost defied notice. He was the man no one remembered. After meeting the quiet coworker at the back of meetings, the figure on the train who always gave up his seat but never made eye contact. At 42, he had built a life around invisibility, finding comfort in routine and distance in silence. To his colleagues at the shipping firm in Shinjuku, he was dependable but unremarkable. "You could set a clock by him," one manager said later. He arrived at 8:45 every day, left at 6, and never spoke about anything beyond numbers. His apartment reflected that same precision. Everything had a place: shirts folded by color, bills stacked in ascending order, coffee cups aligned perfectly along the shelf. The neighbors occasionally heard classical music drifting through the walls. Bach mostly played at low volume. There were no parties, no guests, no signs of companionship. Yet nothing about Kenji's life suggested loneliness. It was as if he had designed solitude the way an engineer designs a bridge: functional, quiet, unyielding. But in the months before he disappeared, small fractures appeared in his perfect structure. His sister Yumi noticed it first. During one of their weekly phone calls, he asked if she ever felt watched. When she laughed it off, he didn't. "Sometimes I hear clicking," he said, "like someone taking pictures from inside the walls." She assumed he was joking. Later, when she visited, she found strips of tape covering the webcam on his computer and tiny mirrors mounted in the corners of the living room. "Just for peace of mind," he told her, smiling tightly. At work, coworkers began to whisper about his behavior. He had started arriving early and leaving late, often sitting in the parking lot long after everyone else had gone home. One evening, the security guard found him standing in the rain, staring up at the office windows. When asked what he was doing, Sato replied, "I'm waiting for the lights to stop moving." No one understood what he meant. The next day, he apologized and blamed exhaustion. Then came the incident at the train station. Surveillance footage, later reviewed by police, showed Sato waiting for his usual train at Tokyo Station. He checked his watch, looked up, and suddenly stepped backward, his face pale. He turned, walked briskly out of the station, and vanished into the crowd. That night, he sent an email to his supervisor, apologizing for causing concern and requesting a week off for personal reasons. It was approved without question. He never returned. Detective Tanaka pieced together the timeline like a jigsaw puzzle, missing half its pieces. He visited the company, interviewed co-workers, and collected CCTV footage from nearby streets. The pattern was unsettling. Every camera that caught Sato in his final week showed him glancing behind him, shoulders hunched as if expecting someone to appear. In one clip, he paused outside a convenience store and seemed to speak to someone off-screen, except no one else was visible. Psychological experts suggested paranoia brought on by isolation, perhaps amplified by exhaustion or depression. But Tanaka wasn't convinced. Paranoia doesn't erase people, he said. Fear doesn't lock a door from the inside. The physical evidence refused to fit any mental diagnosis. Inside the apartment, the detective found another clue hidden in plain sight. Behind a row of perfectly aligned books on Sato's shelf lay a small voice recorder. Its battery was dead, but forensic technicians recovered the last entry, an audio file time-stamped August 4th, 1039 p.m., 3 minutes before he was last seen entering his apartment. The recording lasted less than 20 seconds. The first few seconds were silence. Then came a sound, a low mechanical hum, followed by what seemed like static. Finally, a voice whispered something indistinct, almost a breath rather than a word. Forensic specialists enhanced the file, slowed it, filtered it. The result chilled everyone in the room. The whisper was faint but clear. He's here. No one could determine whether it was Sato's voice or someone else's. The sound pattern didn't match his speech from previous recordings. It was lower, rougher, like a voice distorted through an old speaker. When Tanaka replayed it, the hum beneath the whisper grew louder, rhythmic, pulsing like a heartbeat through the static. The file ended abruptly. Tanaka sat in the darkened apartment for hours afterward, listening again and again. He's here. The phrase echoed in his head until it stopped sounding like a warning and began to feel like an announcement. If someone or something had been inside that apartment with Kenji Sato, then the locked door wasn't a mystery. It was a trap. And somewhere beyond the walls, whatever had claimed him might still be waiting. Detective Hiroshi Tanaka returned to the apartment the next morning with a small team of forensic specialists. The hallway outside was silent, the air thick with the faint smell of disinfectant and dust. Apartment 503 looked exactly as they had left it, the chains still latched, the shoes still lined neatly beside the coffee table. But now, the room felt different. It had the tension of a stage waiting for the next scene to begin. Tanaka ordered the lights off and instructed the team to use blacklight. The ultraviolet glow revealed something the naked eye couldn't see, a faint pattern of handprints smudged across the walls, clustered near the kitchen counter and along the hallway leading to the bedroom. None of them matched Kenji Sato's prints. The spacing was too wide, the shapes distorted, as if whoever made them had pressed from the wrong side of the wall. The technicians froze, unsure whether to call it contamination or something stranger. They dusted again, photographed everything, and checked the building's maintenance logs. No one had entered that room since the last inspection 6 months earlier. No renovations, no wall repairs, no reason for those prints to exist. Tanaka wrote in his notebook, foreign contact, impossible orientation, source unknown. He closed the book without showing it to anyone. The next step was to dismantle the apartment itself. Every vent, floor panel, and section of drywall was inspected. They found nothing, no crawl space, no hidden chamber, not even wiring large enough for a person to fit through. The electricity grid showed the same surge at 10:47 p.m., 5 minutes after Sato returned home. Engineers confirmed that no other unit experienced it. The surge originated from inside apartment 503. It's as if something powered on, one technician said, and then vanished. Tanaka replayed the voice recording again while standing in the empty room. He's here. The whisper seemed to bleed into the sound of the fluorescent bulbs above. He imagined Sato sitting in the same spot, hearing the same hum, turning toward the walls just before disappearing. The thought left him uneasy. To rule out human interference, investigators reviewed all security footage from the building for the fourth time. Nothing unusual appeared, no strangers, no service workers, no deliveries. But at exactly 10:47 p.m., the hallway camera outside Sato's door flickered for half a second. The timestamp froze, skipped forward one frame, then returned to normal. In that missing instant, the screen went completely black. Tanaka requested the raw data from the building's security company. The technician hesitated. That blackout, he said, shouldn't be possible. Each camera has an independent power source. Even if one failed, the others wouldn't. But 3 cameras on the same floor glitched at the exact same moment. The coincidence was mathematically impossible. Back in the lab, a digital forensics analyst enhanced the frozen frame before the blackout. The image was grainy, distorted by compression. But in the reflection on Sato's metal door handle, they saw a shape. It was blurred, stretched by the curvature of the steel, but unmistakably humanoid, standing just behind him as he entered. The room went silent. Tanaka leaned closer to the monitor. "Can you isolate it?" he asked. The analyst zoomed in until the pixels bled together. The outline sharpened slightly, a tall figure, shoulders hunched, head tilted. No face. Only darkness. For the rest of that day, the investigation team avoided talking about the reflection. The official report mentioned visual artifact due to lens interference. But every officer present knew what they had seen. The reflection wasn't a trick of light, it was a presence. Tanaka began sleeping less, returning to the apartment at night to sit in the dark and listen. He left his recorder on just as Sato once had. Most nights he captured only silence. But on the 5th night something changed. At precisely 10:47 p.m., the same moment as the original surge, his recorder picked up a low hum, followed by a single sound, a faint knock from inside the wall. He froze, listening. Then another knock. 3 beats, slow and deliberate, from the exact spot where the strange handprints had appeared under ultraviolet light. When he switched on the lamp, the air seemed to vibrate as if the walls were breathing. The hum faded, and the apartment fell silent again. He packed his equipment, locked the door, and left without speaking to anyone. In his log that night, he wrote only 4 words: "He's here, still here." Detective Hiroshi Tanaka stopped trusting the clocks in his apartment after the first week. They all seemed to drift toward the same time, 10:47 p.m., even when he reset them. His phone froze at that minute once the second hand of his wristwatch stuttered and his computer restarted itself. At first, he blamed exhaustion. He had been working non-stop, revisiting the Sato case, watching the same grainy footage until the reflection on the doorknob began to feel like a living thing. His colleagues told him to take leave, but he couldn't. Every night he replayed the recording he'd made inside apartment 503, the hum, the faint knocks. Each time he listened, he heard something new beneath the sound, something like breathing. The noise floor, one audio technician explained when Tanaka sent the file for analysis. It's interference from the walls. But when the technician tried to replicate it, the same hum appeared again at exactly 10:47 p.m. Despite being recorded hours apart. Tanaka's obsession deepened. He visited Sato's sister to learn more about his final days. She showed him a set of old photos, family gatherings, birthdays, a camping trip in Nagano. In every picture, Sato stood slightly apart from the group, as if trying not to be noticed. But in one image, a dinner from late July, Tanaka noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Behind Sato, reflected in the glass window, was a faint silhouette. The outline was identical to the shape captured on the apartment's doorknob. He didn't tell her what he saw. Instead, he borrowed the photo for evidence review, placed it on his desk, and stared at it until the lights in his office flickered. That night, he returned again to the apartment. It was routine now, part of a ritual he couldn't explain. The building manager no longer questioned him. Tanaka arrived alone, unlocked the door, and set his recorder on the table beside the same pair of shoes that had belonged to Kenji Sato. The apartment smelled faintly of metal and old dust. He sat in the dark listening. The silence had weight to it like air pressed inside glass. Then as the seconds crawled toward the familiar time, the atmosphere shifted. The temperature dropped. His breath fogged. The fluorescent light above flickered once, twice, and went out. The first knock came from inside the wall to his left. Then another closer. Tanaka gripped the flashlight, whispering, "Who's there?" The third knock echoed directly behind him. He turned, but there was only the faint outline of his own shadow stretching across the floor. He tried the light switch. It didn't work. The apartment was sealed again, chains still latched, yet the sense of presence grew stronger. From somewhere near the kitchen, a low hum rose, the same frequency from the recordings. It pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, and beneath it a whisper, not words this time, just the sound of breath brushing through air that shouldn't have been moving. He reached for his phone to check the time. The screen glowed 1047. The digits refused to change. Later, when Tanaka's colleagues found him, he was standing outside the building, drenched in sweat, his eyes unfocused. He couldn't explain how he'd unlocked the chain from the inside. The recorder on the table was still running. The audio captured 42 minutes of silence, followed by 3 knocks, then a voice faintly overlapping his own 2 people, breathing in the same rhythm. The next morning, Tanaka requested reassignment from the case. The official reason cited exhaustion. Unofficially, his superiors knew he was unraveling. The voice on the recording had been analyzed by 2 separate labs. Both reached the same conclusion. The secondary voice matched Tanaka's frequency range and speech pattern perfectly, but it overlapped his own timestamps. He had spoken and been answered by himself milliseconds apart. When asked if he had any explanation, Tanaka said, "Maybe whatever took Sato is trying to replace him." He laughed after saying it, but no one else did. He retired 2 months later. Apartment 503 was sealed permanently, the door welded shut. The building was eventually renovated, new tenants moved in, and life continued. But late at night, security guards still reported strange electrical surges around the 5th floor. Sometimes just before midnight, their radios crackled with a voice, saying only 3 words, "He's here again." After Detective Hiroshi Tanaka's resignation, the case of Kenji Sato was officially marked as unsolved and quietly filed away in the archives of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police. On paper, it was nothing more than a missing person investigation with insufficient evidence. But among the officers who had worked the scene, it was known by another name, the room that looked back. None of them volunteered to return to apartment 503. Even the building's cleaning crew refused to enter without daylight. In early 2020, the entire floor underwent renovation. New drywall was installed, the wiring replaced, and the doors painted over with a fresh layer of white. When workers removed the old panels, they discovered something strange between the insulation and the concrete. a series of indentations faint but deliberate, like impressions left by human hands pushing outward. The foreman ordered the area resealed without report, dismissing it as old structural warping. But one worker kept a photograph. Years later, he admitted that the imprints had been warm to the touch. Tanaka never spoke publicly about what he experienced. He moved to the countryside north of Yokohama, living alone in a small house surrounded by forest. The police pension allowed him quiet retirement, but his neighbors said he never seemed to rest. Every night they saw light flicker in his study window until dawn. When asked about it once, he smiled and said he was just waiting for the right hour. He died in 2023, found seated at his desk. The clock on the wall beside him was stopped at 1047. On the table was a recorder still running, containing 52 minutes of faint static, followed by 3 knocks identical in rhythm to those recorded in apartment 503. After that came a whisper, low and calm, "Welcome home." When the file reached Tokyo headquarters, it was never linked officially to the Sato case. Too much time had passed, too many unanswered questions. Yet officers who remembered the original investigation recognized the pattern instantly. The handwriting in Tanaka's final note matched his old field logs perfectly. It contained only 4 words: "He's here, with me." The apartment building that once housed Unit 503 no longer exists. It was demolished in 2025 to make way for a new commercial tower. During demolition, workers reported power outages and tools that stopped working near the center of the 5th floor. The site foreman described the air there as thick, like standing inside a running engine. The story never made the news, but construction halted for 3 days without explanation. When the tower finally opened its elevators, occasionally paused between the 4th and 5th floors for a fraction of a second, long enough for passengers to feel the drop in gravity and glance nervously at each other. Urban legends grew quickly. Some said that if you stand outside the building at night, you can hear faint knocking through the concrete, always 3 times, always at the same moment, 1047 p.m. Others swore they saw a reflection move in the glass of the upper windows, even when no one was inside. Online forums nicknamed it the Tower of Shadows. For a while it became a curiosity, then a myth, then just another story people told when the city's lights flickered. But for those who knew the truth, the memory stayed heavier. They remembered the pattern, the missing man, the sealed room, the voice on the recording. They knew that walls, once they have absorbed enough fear, never really forget the sound that made them tremble. If you listen closely in any old building in Tokyo, you'll hear the city breathing through its pipes and wires, 1,000 lives stacked on top of one another, their echoes trapped in steel and glass. And somewhere among them, maybe at 1047 tonight, a faint voice might whisper back. Because the walls always remember, they just wait for someone who listens long enough to hear them. When all the stories are finished, when every crime has been dissected, and every question chased into silence, what remains are not the answers, but the echoes. The voices of those who were lost still hum beneath the noise of the world, waiting for someone to stop and listen. From Anastasia's locked apartment in Moscow to Tao I-Ching's cold dormitory in Nanjing, from the quiet villa in Binfurk to the sealed room in Tokyo, each story begins the same way: an ordinary moment, an ordinary life. And then, without warning, the ordinary disappears. We spend our days believing that evil is something distant, a shadow we can predict or prepare for. But it isn't. It sits beside us on buses, smiles politely across dinner tables, holds open doors. It wears the faces we trust, the ones we love, and sometimes the one in the mirror. The truth is that evil rarely arrives with thunder. It comes softly in the sound of footsteps on familiar floors. And by the time we notice, it's already inside. If there's anything these stories share, it's that safety is an illusion stitched together by habit, locks, cameras, alarms. They give comfort, not protection. What saves us, what really keeps us human, is awareness, the willingness to see, to ask, to remember. Because forgetting is how darkness survives. Every victim in these stories lived full lives before their endings were rewritten by someone else. Anastasia wanted freedom. Tao I Ching wanted education. The Liu family and Bin Furk wanted peace. Kenji Sato only wanted to be left alone. None of them deserved what found them. Their stories remind us that tragedy doesn't always teach, it simply demands we pay attention. So if you're listening to this late at night, sitting in the dark the way I am now, take a moment to breathe. Look around your room. Notice the stillness, the small sounds that make the silence feel alive. That's the world reminding you it's real, that you are, and that you're not alone. Because outside right now, the rain has started again. Soft at first, tapping gently against the window, before building into a steady rhythm. It's the kind of sound that narrows the world to a single room, a single light, and the voice you're hearing. Somewhere, the rain is falling on streets where these stories happened, on Nanjing's campus gates, on the ruins of the Liu family's villa, on the pavement below a vanished man's apartment. It's the same rain falling across every place that ever held a secret. And maybe that's why we tell these stories, not to frighten, but to remember. The rain washes away the blood, the evidence, the fear, but memory, that stays. So if you've listened this far, thank you for giving voice to the ones who can no longer speak. If you haven't already, make sure you're safe, lock your doors, and leave a light on tonight. Not because something's out there waiting, but because somewhere, someone once wished they had. Good night, and wherever you are, listen closely. Sometimes the rain carries more than just water. Sometimes it carries what the world forgot.